Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The snow had been falling for 12 hours straight when Officer Earl received the dispatch call. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in February, and the temperature had dropped to 7 degrees below zero. The small town of Millbrook, Wisconsin, was buried under 3 feet of fresh powder, with more coming down every minute. Earl had been patrolling the empty streets for the past 4 hours, watching for stranded motorists and checking on the elderly residents who lived alone in the older neighborhoods. Unit 7, we have a possible home invasion in progress at 1847 Maple Street. Caller is an elderly female, says someone is in her house. She's locked herself in the bathroom. Earl grabbed his radio immediately. Unit 7 responding. ETA 3 minutes. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy snow as Earl navigated through the deserted streets. Maple Street was in the oldest part of town, where houses built in the 1940s sat on large lots surrounded by ancient oak trees. Most of the residents were retirees who had lived there for decades. Crime was almost non-existent in this neighborhood, which made the call all the more concerning. Unit 7, be advised, caller identifies herself as Mildred Harrison, age 78, lives alone. Says she heard glass breaking about 10 minutes ago, then footsteps in her house. She's in the upstairs bathroom with the door locked. Earl's 23 years on the force had taught him that home invasions targeting the elderly were particularly dangerous. Criminals who preyed on older victims were often more violent, knowing their victims couldn't fight back effectively. The snowstorm would delay any backup by at least 15 minutes, maybe more. He would be going in alone. As he turned onto Maple Street, Earl killed his headlights and approached the house slowly. 1847 was a 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters, barely visible through the falling snow. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow over the front steps, but the rest of the house was dark. Earl parked 3 houses down and approached on foot, his boots crunching through the fresh snow. The first thing he noticed were footprints leading from the street to the side of the house. They were fresh, maybe 20 minutes old at most, already partially filled with new snow. Earl followed them carefully, his hand resting on his service weapon. The prints led around to the back of the house, where he found a basement window broken, glass scattered on the snow beneath it. Earl keyed his radio quietly. Dispatch, Unit 7. I've got forced entry through a basement window at the rear of the residence, requesting immediate backup. Copy that, Unit 7. Backup is en route, but the roads are bad. Estimate 15 to 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Too long to wait with an elderly woman trapped in her bathroom and an intruder in the house. Earl made his decision. He would go in through the front door, which appeared intact. Better to enter from an unexpected direction than follow the intruder's path through the basement. Earl climbed the front porch steps carefully, avoiding the creaky boards he could identify even under the snow. The front door was locked. He had Mildred's phone number from dispatch and called it quietly. Mrs. Harrison? This is Officer Earl with the Millbrook Police. I'm outside your house. Are you safe? The voice that answered was thin and frightened, barely above a whisper. Oh, thank God. Yes, I'm in the bathroom. I can hear him downstairs. He's going through my things. Stay where you are, ma'am. Keep the door locked. I'm coming in. Earl tried the door handle again, then noticed a ceramic frog near the doormat. The universal hiding spot for spare keys in small towns. Sure enough, underneath was a key. He inserted it slowly, wincing at every small sound. The door opened into a dark foyer. Earl stepped inside, closing the door silently behind him. The house smelled of potpourri and old wood, the comforting scent of a grandmother's home. Earl could hear movement from somewhere below, drawers being opened, items being moved. The intruder was still in the basement. Earl moved through the foyer into the living room, his flashlight off to avoid announcing his presence. His eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and he could make out the shapes of furniture, a piano against one wall, family photos covering every surface. A staircase led up to the second floor where Mildred was hiding. Another door near the kitchen presumably led to the basement. Earl positioned himself where he could watch both, then keyed his radio on its lowest setting. "Dispatch, Unit 7, I'm inside the residence. Suspect appears to be in the basement. Victim is secure upstairs." Before dispatch could respond, Earl heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy footsteps, moving without any attempt at stealth. The intruder thought he had all the time in the world with an elderly woman cowering upstairs. The door to the basement began to open. Earl raised his weapon and flashlight simultaneously. "Police!" "Don't move." The figure in the doorway froze. In the harsh beam of Earl's flashlight stood a man, probably mid-30s, wearing dark clothing and a ski mask. His hands were full of what looked like jewelry boxes and silverware. For a moment, neither moved. Then the suspect dropped everything and ran. Not toward Earl, but back down the basement stairs, moving faster than Earl would have expected. Earl followed, shouting, "Stop! Police!" The basement was cluttered with decades of accumulated possessions. Old furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, a washer and dryer. The suspect navigated it like he knew the layout, heading straight for the broken window. Earl caught up just as the man was trying to squeeze through the window. He grabbed the suspect's leg and pulled hard. The man fell back into the basement, then spun and swung at Earl with something metal, a crowbar he must have used to break in. Earl dodged, but the tool caught his shoulder, sending a shock of pain down his arm. The suspect swung again, and this time Earl was ready. He caught the man's wrist and twisted, using a technique drilled into him during training. The crowbar clattered to the floor. They grappled in the dim basement, knocking over boxes and sending their contents spilling across the concrete floor. The suspect was younger and desperate, but Earl had training. Finally, Earl managed to get the suspect on the ground, face down, and pulled out his handcuffs. The man struggled, but Earl got one wrist cuffed, then the other. Only then did he realize he was breathing hard, his shoulder throbbing where the crowbar had connected. "Unit 7? Suspect in custody," he panted into his radio. "Need that backup and medical for a shoulder injury." "Copy that, Unit 7. ETA 5 minutes. Earl pulled the ski mask off the suspect. The face underneath was unfamiliar. A young man with hollow cheeks and desperate eyes, probably looking for items to sell for drug money. But something about him seemed off. His eyes weren't focused on Earl, but on something behind him, and his expression had changed from anger to fear. "You don't understand," the suspect said. "I wasn't robbing her. I was trying to get her out." "Save it for booking," Earl said, but the man continued. "Check on her. The old lady, she called you, right? Go check on her right now." Something in the man's voice made Earl uneasy. He pulled the suspect to his feet and half-dragged him to the basement stairs, cuffing him to the railing. Then he went upstairs, calling out, "Mrs. Harrison, it's Officer Earl. I have the intruder in custody. You can come out now." No response. Earl climbed to the second floor. The bathroom door was still closed. He knocked gently. "Mrs. Harrison, are you all right?" And still nothing. Earl tried the handle. Locked. He knocked harder. "Mrs. Harrison, please answer me." The silence was deafening. Earl stepped back and kicked the door. It took 3 tries before the old lock gave way and the door swung open. The bathroom was empty. The window was closed and locked from the inside. There was nowhere to hide. It was a small bathroom with a tub, toilet, and sink. But Mildred Harrison was not there. Earl felt his blood run cold. He searched the other rooms upstairs quickly. All empty. The beds were made, everything in perfect order. In what must have been Mildred's room, he found a purse on the dresser with a wallet inside. The driver's license photo showed an elderly woman with white hair and kind eyes. Mildred Harrison, age 78, the same address. Earl ran back downstairs to where the suspect was cuffed. "Where is she? What did you do with her?" The young man looked up at him with those hollow eyes. "I told you, I was trying to get her out. But I was too late." "Check the kitchen." Earl moved to the kitchen, his weapon drawn again. At first, everything looked normal. Clean counters, dishes in the drying rack. Then he saw it. On the kitchen table was a newspaper, dated February 15th. Today was February 22nd, a week old. Next to it was a coffee mug with mold growing on the remnants of coffee inside. His radio crackled. "Unit 7. Backup is arriving now." Earl heard sirens approaching, saw flashing lights through the windows. He walked back to the suspect. "How long has she been gone?" "I don't know exactly. My grandmother lived next door. She was friends with Mrs. Harrison. Gran died 2 months ago, and I came to clean out her house this week. I noticed Mrs. Harrison's mail piling up, newspapers on the porch. I knocked. No answer. Tonight, I saw someone inside with a flashlight moving around. I thought maybe she had fallen or something, so I broke in to check." "You're saying you're not a burglar?" "Look at what I was carrying. Those aren't valuable jewelry boxes. They're full of medication. I was trying to figure out what she took, if she overdosed or something. I found her purse, her wallet, everything still here. But no Mildred." The backup officers entered, and Earl quickly briefed them. They searched the house thoroughly. No sign of Mildred Harrison anywhere. No signs of violence either, except for the broken basement window. The phone in the bathroom that Mildred had supposedly called from was there, but when Earl checked the call history, the last call was from 3 days ago. "This doesn't make sense," Officer Clarence, one of the backup officers, said. "Dispatch has a recording of her calling tonight. I heard it on the way over. They called dispatch to confirm. Yes, a woman identifying herself as Mildred Harrison had called from this address at 2:35 a.m. They had her on tape, describing an intruder, saying she was locked in the upstairs bathroom. The call had come from the landline registered to this address, but the phone company records would later show no call was made from that number at that time." The backup officers stood in Mildred Harrison's living room, snow melting off their boots onto the hardwood floor. Officer Clarence was on his radio with dispatch, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. The recorded 911 call was clear. A frightened elderly woman claiming someone had broken into her house. But all evidence suggested Mildred Harrison had been missing for days before that call was made. "Check it again," Clarence was saying into his radio. "The caller ID, the phone records, everything." Earl turned to the suspect, who was now sitting on the couch with his hands still cuffed. "What's your name?" "Chester Williams. My grandmother was Dorothy Williams. She lived at 1845, right next door." Chester's eyes darted between the officers. "Look, I know how this looks, but I'm telling you the truth. I've been staying at my grandmother's house all week, cleaning it out for the estate sale. I knew something was wrong here. Earl studied Chester's face. The young man didn't have the look of a typical burglar. No track marks, no gang tattoos. His clothes were clean if a bit worn. Tell me exactly what you saw. Chester took a deep breath. I got to my grandmother's house on Sunday. First thing I noticed was Mrs. Harrison's mail overflowing from her box. That wasn't like her. Gran always said Mildred was particular about everything, kept her yard perfect, collected her mail every day at exactly 3 p.m. I knocked on her door Sunday evening, Monday morning, Monday evening. No answer. Why didn't you call the police then? Clarence interjected. I thought maybe she was visiting family or in the hospital. But then tonight, around 2 a.m., I couldn't sleep. Gran's house feels weird without her, you know. I was looking out the window, and I saw a light moving around in here. Not a normal light, like someone with a flashlight. It moved from room to room, real slow and deliberate. Earl exchanged glances with Clarence. What did you do? I watched for maybe 10 minutes. The light went upstairs, came back down, went to the basement. I thought maybe Mildred had come back and was looking for something, but something felt wrong about how the light was moving. Too careful, like someone who didn't want to be seen. Chester shifted on the couch, his cuffs clinking. I came over and rang the doorbell. No answer. I could still see the light inside, but it had stopped moving, like whoever it was had heard me. I went around back, and that's when I saw the basement window was already broken. Not by me, it was broken from the inside out. Earl walked to the basement to check. Chester was right. The glass shards were mostly on the outside, in the snow. Someone had broken it from within the house. So, you went in through the window? Earl asked when he returned. Yeah, I know I shouldn't have, but I was worried about Mrs. Harrison. The basement was a mess. Boxes everywhere. Stuff spilled on the floor. I found some of her medication bottles scattered around. That's what I was collecting when you arrived. I was trying to see if she had taken something, if maybe she had dementia or something and wandered off. The radio crackled again. Dispatch had more information. The 911 call had indeed come from the house's landline number, but the phone company showed no record of the call in their system. It was as if the call had materialized out of thin air. This is impossible, Clarence muttered. Calls don't just appear in our system without going through the phone company. Earl walked to the kitchen and picked up the wall-mounted phone. He hit redial. The last number called was to a doctor's office, dated 3 days ago, according to the caller ID. He scrolled through the recent calls. Nothing from tonight. Chester, you said you saw a light moving around. Did you see who was holding it? Chester shook his head. Just the light. But he paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. But what? This is going to sound crazy, but the light didn't move like a person carrying a flashlight. It was too smooth, too steady, like it was floating. Clarence scoffed, but Earl held up a hand. In his experience, witnesses often held back details they thought sounded unbelievable, and those details were sometimes the most important. Let's search the house properly, Earl said. Every room, every closet. Chester, you're coming with us. You knew Mrs. Harrison through your grandmother. You might notice if something's out of place. They started in the basement. It was indeed chaotic, but Chester pointed out that some of the mess seemed old. Dust on overturned boxes, cobwebs already formed over spilled contents. But other disturbances were fresh. A clear path had been made through the clutter, leading from the stairs to the broken window. In a corner, Earl found something odd. A pile of women's clothing, neatly folded. A floral dress, cardigan, stockings, and sensible shoes. The kind of outfit an elderly woman might wear to church. "Are these Mrs. Harrison's?" he asked Chester. Chester looked closer. "That's what she was wearing the last time I saw her. Gran's funeral, 2 months ago. She gave me a hug, told me Dorothy was the best friend she ever had. The clothes were clean, no signs of violence, just neatly folded and placed in the corner like someone had carefully removed them." They moved upstairs. Mildred's bedroom was pristine, the bed made with military precision. Her medications were lined up on the nightstand: heart medication, blood pressure pills, vitamins. Earl checked the dates. The prescriptions had been filled 2 weeks ago, but the pill count suggested she hadn't taken any in at least a week. In the closet, all her clothes were arranged by color. Shoes lined up perfectly. But there was a gap in the clothing rod, like several outfits were missing. "Chester, look at this closet. Notice anything?" Chester studied it. "Her church clothes are gone. She had 3 or 4 nice dresses she rotated for church and special occasions. Gran used to tease her about being so formal. They're all missing, but they had found one church outfit in the basement. Why would the others be gone?" The bathroom, where Mildred had supposedly locked herself, was small and ordinary. Earl checked the window. Painted shut. Probably hadn't been opened in years. The medicine cabinet contained typical elderly person supplies: denture cream, aspirin, bandages. But something caught his eye. On the sink was a glass with dentures still in it. "Would she leave without her dentures?" Earl asked. Chester shook his head. "No way. Gran said Mildred was vain about her appearance, even at her age. She wouldn't go anywhere without her teeth." They checked the other rooms. A guest bedroom that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A sewing room with a half-finished quilt on a frame. Then they found the 3rd bedroom, and Earl stopped in the doorway. This room was different. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled. Clothes were strewn on the floor. The dresser drawers were pulled out, contents spilled. It looked like someone had been living in here recently, but carelessly, unlike the neat precision of the rest of the house. "This isn't right," Chester said. "Mrs. Harrison would never leave a room like this." Earl noticed something else. The clothes on the floor weren't elderly woman's clothes. They were younger in style: jeans, t-shirts, a leather jacket. Size small, but definitely not something a 78-year-old would wear. "Someone else has been staying here," Clarence said, stating the obvious. Earl walked to the dresser. Among the scattered items were photographs. Not the formal family photos displayed throughout the house, but Polaroids. He picked one up and felt his stomach turn cold. It was a photo of Mildred Harrison. She was sitting in what looked like a basement, not her basement, somewhere else. Concrete walls, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. She was wearing one of her church dresses and staring at the camera with an expression of resigned fear. "Jesus," Clarence breathed, looking over Earl's shoulder. There were more photos, all of Mildred, all in the same concrete room. In some, she was sitting on a cot. In others, standing by a metal door. The photos seemed to span several days, her hair becoming increasingly disheveled, her clothes more wrinkled. "She's being held somewhere," Earl said. "These photos, someone's documenting it." Chester had gone pale. Who would do this? Why? Earl's radio crackled. It was dispatch again, and the voice sounded shaken. "Unit 7, we've received another call. Same voice as earlier, claiming to be Mildred Harrison. She says she can see you in her house right now. She's describing what you're wearing, what room you're in." Earl felt the hair on his neck stand up. He was in the 3rd bedroom, wearing his standard blue uniform with his badge number visible. What exactly is she saying? She says, Officer Earl is holding a photograph. Officer Clarence is by the door. There's a young man in handcuffs. She's crying, saying, "Please don't let her take anything else." "Her?" Earl asked. "Who is her?" The caller won't say. Just keeps repeating, "Don't let her take anything else," and crying. Earl looked around the room more carefully. In the corner was a small camera, the kind used for home security, but it was turned off, unplugged. The red recording light was dark. "Trace the call," Earl ordered. "Get an exact location." While they waited, Earl continued examining the photos. In the background of one, he could make out part of a sign on the wall. It was partially obscured, but he could see Orage Uni, and below it, Mate Kant. "Storage unit," Clarence said. "Climate controlled." Chester suddenly spoke up. "There's a storage facility about 3 miles from here, Millbrook Self-Storage. Gran had a unit there for years. She gave me the key before she died, said everything in it was mine." Earl turned to him. "Do you still have that key?" Chester nodded. "It's at Gran's house. Unit 47. Clarence, stay here with Chester. Keep searching the house. I'm going to check that storage facility." "Earl, wait for backup." But Earl was already moving. Something about this whole situation felt urgent, like time was running out. The snow had let up slightly, but the roads were still treacherous. He drove as fast as he safely could, his mind racing. The storage facility was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence. The gate was supposed to be locked after 10 p.m., but it was standing open. Earl drove through, his headlights sweeping across rows of identical storage units. Unit 47 was in the back corner. Earl approached carefully, his hand on his weapon. The padlock was hanging open. He could hear something inside. A soft humming, like someone singing to themselves. He pulled the door open. Inside, illuminated by a battery-powered lantern, was an elderly woman. But it wasn't Mildred Harrison. This woman was younger, maybe in her 60s, with wild gray hair and bright manic eyes. She was sitting at a folding table, speaking into a cell phone. "Yes, he's here now," she was saying in a perfect imitation of an elderly woman's voice. "The officer is here. He's found my secret room." Earl recognized the voice. It was the same one from the 911 calls. The woman looked up at him and smiled. "Hello, Officer Earl. Mildred's been waiting for you." "Where is Mildred Harrison?" Earl demanded, his weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. The woman stood up slowly. She was wearing one of Mildred's church dresses, but it hung loose on her thinner frame. "I am Mildred Harrison. I've always been Mildred Harrison. Ever since Dorothy died and left me all alone. You're not Mildred. Where is she?" The woman's smile widened. "Dorothy was my only friend. When she died, Mildred didn't even cry at the funeral. Just hugged Chester and went home to her perfect little life. But Dorothy was everything to me. We were in the nursing home together before I got better and they let me out. Dorothy understood me. Mildred never did." Earl kept his weapon ready but tried to keep his voice calm. "What's your name?" "I told you. I'm Mildred now. The other one. She didn't deserve that name, didn't deserve that house, didn't deserve Dorothy's friendship. Where is the real Mildred?" The woman gestured to the back of the storage unit. There was another door, leading to an adjoining unit. Earl moved carefully, keeping an eye on the woman. He opened the door. The adjoining unit had been converted into a crude living space. A cot, a portable toilet, a small refrigerator running off a generator. And on the cot, lying very still, was Mildred Harrison. Earl rushed to the cot, keeping one eye on the woman who claimed to be Mildred. The real Mildred Harrison was unconscious but breathing, her chest rising and falling slowly. She was wearing one of her church dresses, but it was dirty and wrinkled. Her white hair was matted, and there were restraint marks on her wrists. "What did you do to her?" Earl demanded, reaching for his radio to call for an ambulance. The woman, the imposter, laughed. It was a strange, childlike sound. "I gave her something to help her sleep. She was so noisy at first, crying and begging. But I explained to her that I needed to learn. I needed to become her. Dorothy would have wanted us to be friends." Earl called for backup and an ambulance, giving the location. Then he checked Mildred's pulse. It was weak, but steady. There were 4 marks on her arm, and several empty IV bags in a trash bin nearby. The woman had been keeping her hydrated at least. "How long has she been here?" Earl asked. "Since Dorothy's funeral. 2 months. Well, not here exactly. We moved around a bit. I had to find the right place. Dorothy's storage unit seemed fitting, don't you think? A place where memories are kept." Earl noticed a notebook on a shelf. He picked it up, flipping through it while keeping his weapon ready. It was filled with observations about Mildred Harrison, her daily routine, her manner of speaking, her favorite phrases, phone numbers of her friends, her doctor, her church. The woman had been studying Mildred like a scientist studying a specimen. "You've been calling her friends, pretending to be her," Earl said. "I had to practice." The voice was easy. I've always been good with voices. But the words, the way she talked about things, that took time. I called her doctor to cancel appointments. Called her church friends to say she was visiting family. I've been living in her house for a week now, being her. And tonight? The 911 call? The woman's expression darkened. That stupid boy, Chester. He was supposed to be gone by now. Dorothy's house should have been sold, but he stayed, and he kept watching. I saw him looking at the house. I knew he'd eventually try to get in, so I called you first. I thought if the police found him breaking in, he'd be arrested and leave me alone. Earl heard sirens approaching. His backup was almost here. But why take her clothes? Why the photographs? I needed to understand her. How she moved, how she dressed. The photographs were to study her expressions. Did you know she has 17 different smiles? One for strangers, one for friends, one for when she's being polite, but doesn't mean it. Dorothy only had 3 smiles, and they were all real. The woman moved closer to Mildred's unconscious form. Earl raised his weapon. "Step back. I'm not going to hurt her." "Not anymore. She's almost used up anyway." Used up? Her life, her identity. I've taken most of it now, her house, her routines, her voice. Soon, there won't be anything left of the old Mildred, just me. The backup officers arrived, along with paramedics. They rushed in, immediately attending to Mildred. One of the paramedics looked at the IV marks and the empty bags. "She's been sedated, probably with surgical anesthetic. We need to get her to the hospital now." As they loaded Mildred onto a stretcher, she stirred slightly. Her eyes opened, unfocused and confused. She looked at Earl, then at the woman in her dress. "Dorothy?" she whispered. "Is that you?" The imposter smiled that practiced smile. "No, dear. Dorothy's gone. I'm you now." Mildred's eyes widened in terror before the paramedics sedated her for transport. Officer Clarence arrived as they were taking the imposter into custody. "Earl, you need to hear this. We found more at the house. There's a whole room in the attic we missed. It's like a shrine." Earl left the imposter with the other officers and followed Clarence back to Mildred's house. Chester was still there, sitting in the back of a patrol car for his own protection. They climbed to the attic, which was accessed through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling that they had overlooked earlier. The attic had been transformed. The walls were covered with photographs, but not of Mildred. They were all of Dorothy Williams, Chester's grandmother. Hundreds of them, spanning what looked like years. Dorothy at the grocery store, Dorothy in her garden, Dorothy at church. Many were taken from a distance, through windows, without Dorothy's knowledge. In the center of the room was a mannequin dressed in Dorothy's clothes. Chester identified them immediately as items that had gone missing from his grandmother's house over the years. The mannequin was positioned in a chair, facing a table set for two, with real china and silverware. "This is sick," Clarence muttered. There were journals, dozens of them, filled with the imposter's writings about Dorothy. Love letters never sent, imaginary conversations, detailed plans for a life together that existed only in the writer's mind. One entry, dated the day of Dorothy's funeral, stood out, "She left me. Dorothy left me alone." But Mildred got to say goodbye. Mildred got the final hug. Mildred has the house next door. If I can't have Dorothy, I'll have Dorothy's life. I'll be the friend she chose. I'll be Mildred. And then Dorothy and I will be together again, in memory, if nothing else. Chester, who had been brought up to identify items, was visibly shaken. Gran never mentioned this woman. Who is she? Earl found a file folder with official documents. Medical discharge papers from Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital dated 3 years ago. The patient's name was Gladys Foster. Diagnosis: erotomania and dissociative identity disorder. There were treatment notes describing her fixation on another patient, Dorothy Williams, who had been briefly hospitalized for depression after her husband's death. They met in the psychiatric hospital, Earl said. Dorothy was there for maybe a week, but Gladys was a long-term patient. She developed an obsession. The documents showed that Gladys had been released after showing improvement, but there were warnings about her tendency to fixate on individuals and create elaborate fantasies about relationships that didn't exist. Earl's phone rang. It was the hospital. "Officer Earl, this is Dr. Martinez at Millbrook General. Your victim, Mildred Harrison, she's conscious and wants to speak with you. She says it's urgent." Earl drove to the hospital, his mind racing. The snow had stopped, and dawn was breaking over Millbrook, painting the white landscape in shades of pink and gold. The storm was over, but Earl felt like he was just beginning to understand what had happened. Mildred was in a hospital bed, looking fragile but alert. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. "Officer Earl, thank you for finding me. Mrs. Harrison, I'm so sorry for what you've been through. Gladys Foster's in custody. You're safe now." Mildred shook her head slightly. "That's what I need to tell you. Gladys, she wasn't alone." Earl felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "The first few weeks, it was just her. But then someone else came. Another woman, younger. She called Gladys mother and helped move me to different locations. She's the one who's been living in my house." "Can you describe her?" "Young, maybe 25. Dark hair. She had a tattoo on her wrist, a butterfly. Gladys called her Estelle." Earl immediately called Clarence, who was still at the house. "Check for any signs of a second person, young woman named Estelle." While he waited, Mildred continued. "She was worse than Gladys in some ways. Gladys was sick, delusional, but Estelle knew exactly what she was doing. She enjoyed it. She would try on my clothes and laugh about how she was going to spend my savings." Clarence called back within minutes. "Earl, we found something. There's a laptop hidden in the attic. It's logged into Mildred's bank accounts. Someone's been transferring money out for weeks. Small amounts, but it adds up to about $30,000. The transfers went to an account under the name Estelle Foster. Same last name as Gladys." Earl turned back to Mildred. Did Gladys ever mention having a daughter? She talked about her constantly. Said Estelle was the only one who understood her. That they were going to use my money to buy a house together, somewhere far away where they could start over. Earl coordinated with the other officers. They ran the name Estelle Foster through the system and found her within minutes. She had a record: fraud, identity theft, elder abuse. She'd been released from prison 6 months ago and listed her mother, Gladys Foster, as her emergency contact. An APB was put out for Estelle Foster. Her last known address was an apartment in the next town over, but when officers arrived, they found it had been abandoned weeks ago. The landlord said she'd left in the middle of the night, owing 2 months' rent. Back at the hospital, Mildred was growing tired. The doctors wanted her to rest, but she insisted on telling Earl everything. They had it all planned. Gladys would become me, and Estelle would pretend to be my niece from out of state. They'd already contacted a real estate agent about selling my house. They had forged documents, power of attorney, everything. If Chester hadn't noticed, something was wrong. She trailed off, exhaustion taking over. Earl let her rest and returned to the station where Gladys was being held. She was in an interview room, still wearing Mildred's dress, humming to herself. "Where's Estelle?" Earl asked directly. Gladys looked up with those bright, manic eyes. "Estelle who?" "Your daughter. We know she was helping you." "I don't have a daughter. I've never had children. Dorothy and I were going to adopt once we got married." "Dorothy's dead, Gladys." "She's been dead for 2 months." Gladys's expression didn't change. "No, Dorothy's waiting for me. She's at home making dinner. Pot roast, my favorite. We're going to eat together just like always." Earl realized he wasn't going to get anything useful from Gladys. Her delusions were too strong. But Estelle was still out there, and she had Mildred's money and possibly her identification documents. The search for Estelle Foster continued for 3 days. During that time, more information came to light. She had been visiting her mother at the psychiatric hospital for years, and staff remembered her as manipulative and cruel. She had encouraged her mother's delusions, seeing them as opportunities for financial gain. Bank records showed that the $30,000 had been withdrawn in cash from various ATMs across 3 states. Estelle was running, but she was also smart. She never used the same ATM twice, never stayed in one place long enough to be tracked. On the 4th day, Earl received a call from a detective in Chicago. A woman matching Estelle's description had been arrested trying to use Mildred Harrison's credit card at a hotel. When they searched her room, they found multiple fake IDs, credit cards belonging to at least 5 elderly victims, and a notebook similar to the one Gladys had kept. But this one was full of potential targets: elderly people living alone in small towns across the Midwest. Estelle was extradited back to Wisconsin. Unlike her mother, she showed no signs of mental illness. She was calculating and cold, refusing to speak without a lawyer. But the evidence was overwhelming. She was charged with kidnapping, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. During her trial, the full scope of the mother-daughter operation was revealed. They had done this before, in other states, though never for as long or as elaborately as with Mildred Harrison. They would identify lonely elderly people, study them, and then Gladys would befriend them while Estelle handled the financial aspects. When things got too complicated or risky, they would move on to a new town, new victims. But Gladys's obsession with Dorothy Williams had changed their pattern. Instead of a quick score, Gladys had wanted to actually become Mildred, to live next door to where Dorothy had lived, to maintain the fantasy of their friendship. This deviation from their usual pattern had been their downfall. Mildred Harrison recovered physically, though the psychological trauma took longer to heal. She couldn't return to her house immediately. The thought of someone else living her life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. She was placed in solitary confinement after it was discovered she was trying to steal the identities of other inmates. Gladys Foster died in the psychiatric facility 6 months later. The official cause was heart failure, but staff said she had simply stopped eating after learning about her daughter's arrest. Her last words were reportedly, "Dorothy is waiting for me." But for Earl, the case never really ended. Every welfare check on an elderly resident, every missing person report, every routine call to a quiet neighborhood carried the weight of possibility. The possibility that the person he was talking to wasn't who they claimed to be. A year after Estelle's arrest, Earl received a letter. No return address, postmarked from Arizona. Inside was a photograph of an elderly woman he didn't recognize, sitting on a park bench, feeding pigeons. On the back was written, "Officer Earl, you found 7, but Estelle taught others before she was caught. We learned from the best. Check on your mother, Earl. When did you last see her in person? Are you sure it was really her?" A friend, Earl's mother, lived in Florida. He had talked to her on the phone last week but hadn't visited in 6 months. The voice had sounded right, had said all the right things. But now he wondered. He took emergency leave and flew to Florida that night. His mother answered the door, looking exactly as she should. She hugged him, asked why he hadn't called to say he was coming. Everything was normal. But Earl found himself studying her face, her mannerisms, the way she moved through her own house. She noticed his scrutiny. "What's wrong, honey?" "You're looking at me strangely." "Just a difficult case, Mom. It's made me paranoid." She made his favorite dinner, told the same stories she always told, laughed at the same old jokes. She was perfectly herself. Or was she perfect at being herself? Earl stayed for 3 days, and by the end, he was satisfied. This was his mother. But the doubt that had been planted would never fully go away. Every interaction with anyone, especially elderly people living alone, carried that seed of uncertainty. On his flight back to Wisconsin, Earl read through the case files one more time. Estelle had been right about one thing. They had only found the ones she wanted them to find. How many others had learned her techniques? How many elderly people had vanished without anyone noticing, replaced by younger imposters seeking to steal their Social Security checks, their homes, their very existence? The flight attendant, an elderly woman with a kind smile, offered him coffee. As she poured, Earl found himself studying her hands. They moved with a grace that seemed somehow too youthful for her apparent age. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked. "Fine," Earl said. "Everything's fine." But he watched her walk away, noting the smooth confidence of her gait, wondering who she really was beneath the uniform and the practiced smile. Back in Millbrook, life continued. The house at 1847 Maple Street, Mildred's former home, was sold again after the young family moved away, disturbed by the history they had learned. It stood empty now, a for sale sign slowly being covered by snow. Chester Williams had moved away from Wisconsin entirely, unable to shake the feeling that his grandmother's death had somehow triggered all of this. He still called Earl occasionally, always asking the same question. "Do you think there are more of them out there?" Earl always gave the same answer. "I don't know." But he did know, or at least he suspected. The techniques Gladys and Estelle had developed were too sophisticated, too effective, to die with their imprisonment. Somewhere, in some quiet town, an elderly person was living alone, maintaining their routine, paying their bills, talking to their neighbors, and somewhere else, someone was watching them, taking notes, learning their habits, preparing to become them. Earl continued his patrols through Millbrook's quiet streets. He checked on elderly residents more frequently now, looking for signs he wasn't even sure how to recognize. A gesture that seemed too young, a phrase that sounded rehearsed, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. The snow continued to fall on Millbrook, covering the town in its pristine white blanket, hiding the footprints of whoever might be walking through the night, approaching houses where elderly residents slept alone, unaware that someone was about to steal the one thing they thought could never be taken, their very selves. On his last patrol before retirement, 5 years after that first snowy night at Mildred Harrison's house, Earl drove past 1847 Maple Street one final time. There were lights on inside. The for sale sign was gone. Someone had moved in. He slowed the patrol car, watching. Through the window, he could see an elderly woman moving about the kitchen. She looked familiar, watching and waved, a friendly gesture from a new neighbor. Earl waved back and drove on, but something nagged at him. Something about the way she had moved, too fluid, too purposeful. He checked the property records the next day. The house had been purchased by a woman named Mildred Harrison, but Mildred Harrison was still living in the senior facility across town. Earl had seen her just yesterday. He drove to the senior facility immediately. Mildred was in the common room, playing cards with friends. She looked up as he entered, smiled warmly. "Officer Earl." "How nice to see you, though I guess it's just Mr. Earl, now that you're retired." "Mildred, did you buy your old house back?" She looked confused. "My old house? No, dear. Why would I do that? I'm happy here." Earl's blood ran cold. "Someone bought it using your name." Mildred's face paled. "That's not possible. Who would?" But they both knew who would, or rather they knew what kind of person would. Earl called his replacement at the police department, Officer James Mitchell, young and eager but inexperienced with this particular type of case. Mitchell promised to investigate, but Earl could hear the skepticism in his voice. After all, identity theft was usually about credit cards and bank accounts, not about becoming someone entirely. That night, Earl sat in his living room, officially retired but unable to let go. He thought about calling the FBI, but what would he say? That someone had bought a house using a living person's name. It happened all the time with identity theft, but he knew this was different. This was the continuation of something that had never really ended. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Mildred Harrison's number from the senior facility. He answered. "Earl." It was Mildred's voice, but something was off. It was too steady, too calm. "I wanted to thank you for everything you did for me. I'm going home now." "Mildred, where are you?" "I'm at my house, 1847 Maple Street, where I belong, where I've always belonged." "Mildred, stay at the senior facility. I'm calling the police." "Oh, Earl," still so concerned. "But you're retired now. Time to let go. We all have to learn to let go eventually, even of ourselves." The line went dead. Earl grabbed his keys and drove to the senior facility. Mildred was in her room, sleeping peacefully. She hadn't made any phone calls. He then drove to 1847 Maple Street. The elderly woman he had seen earlier was standing in the window, holding a phone. When she saw him, she smiled and waved again. She looked exactly like Mildred Harrison. Not similar, exact. But Mildred was across town, asleep in her bed. Earl sat in his car, staring at the woman in the window. She placed her hand on the glass, a gesture that seemed almost sympathetic. Then she turned away and disappeared into the house. He could call the police, report this, start another investigation, but he was tired. 5 years of questioning every elderly person he met, of doubting every identity, of seeing potential imposters everywhere. Maybe it was time to let go, or maybe that's what they wanted. For people like him to retire to stop watching, to stop questioning. Earl drove home to his empty house. His wife had passed 3 years ago. His children lived in other states. He was just another elderly person living alone now, maintaining his routines, vulnerable in his isolation. That night, he installed new locks on all his doors and windows. He set up a camera system. He created a code word with his children that only the real Earl would know. Because he understood now that Estelle had been right about one fundamental thing. In a world where anyone could become anyone else, the only protection was vigilance. And even that might not be enough. The next morning, his doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, holding a casserole dish. "Hello, I'm your new neighbor from down the street. Thought I'd introduce myself." Her voice was warm, grandmotherly. Her smile seemed genuine. She could have been anyone's elderly neighbor, bringing food to welcome someone to the neighborhood. Or she could be something else entirely. "That's very kind," Earl said through the door, not opening it. "But I'm not feeling well today." "Oh, that's perfectly fine, dear. I'll just leave this on your porch. It's my famous tuna casserole. You heat it up when you're feeling better." Earl watched through the peephole as she set the dish down and walked away. She moved like an elderly woman should move. Careful steps, one hand on the railing. Perfect, too perfect. He left the casserole on the porch. 3 days later, it was gone. He never saw who took it. The woman in Mildred's old house continued living there. The police investigated briefly but found nothing illegal. The woman had identification saying she was Mildred Harrison. The real Mildred, increasingly confused and frightened, stopped leaving the senior facility. Earl watched from his window as the imposter Mildred went about her daily routine. Mail at 3 p.m., garden watering at 4, lights out at 9:30, exactly as the real Mildred had lived. One evening, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his daughter's number in California. "Dad, how are you?" It was her voice, but Earl had installed that code word system for a reason. "What's our word, sweetheart?" A pause, then a laugh. His daughter's laugh, perfectly reproduced. "Dad, are you serious?" "It's me. The word." Another pause. Then the line went dead. His real daughter called an hour later, confused. "Dad, did you just try to call me?" "I missed it." "No," Earl said, "I didn't call." That night, Earl sat in his dark living room, watching the street. The woman who claimed to be Mildred was standing in her window again, looking directly at his house. She raised her hand slowly, pointed at him, then at herself, then made a gesture he couldn't interpret. The next morning, there was a note under his door. "Stop watching or become watched." "You're retired now, Earl. Some things are better left alone. M.H. Mildred Harrison." But which one? Earl crumpled the note. He was done being passive. He called Officer Mitchell, demanded a meeting. Mitchell came by that afternoon, young and patient, but clearly skeptical. "Mr. Earl, I understand your concerns, but the woman has proper identification. She owns the house legally. There's no evidence of any crime. She's impersonating Mildred Harrison. The Mildred Harrison who is alive and well at the senior facility. How can she be impersonating someone who still exists?" It was a good question, one Earl couldn't answer without sounding insane. After Mitchell left, Earl made a decision. If the police wouldn't help, he would investigate himself. He began watching the imposter Mildred's routine, taking notes just as Gladys and Estelle had once done with their victims. But one night he realized something that chilled him to his core. His notes were wrong. The woman's routine had changed, but his notes showed it hadn't. Someone had been in his house, altering his observations. He checked his security cameras. They showed nothing. The footage from the relevant hours was simply missing. Earl barricaded himself in his bedroom that night, a baseball bat beside his bed. He didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., he heard his front door open, his own keys jingling, footsteps in his living room, slow, shuffling, an elderly person's gait. Earl. It was his wife's voice, his dead wife's voice. "Earl, why did you lock the bedroom door?" Earl gripped the bat, said nothing. "Earl, I'm home. I've been at the hospital, remember? My surgery. Please open the door." The voice was perfect. Every inflection, every tone his wife had used. But his wife had been dead for 3 years. "You're scaring me, Earl. Please." The doorknob turned. Locked. It turned again, more insistent. Then silence. In the morning, Earl found his front door standing open. His keys were on the kitchen table where he hadn't left them. And on his refrigerator was a photo he'd never seen before, his wife and the imposter Mildred, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. The photo was dated yesterday. Earl packed a bag and left Millbrook that day. He couldn't fight this alone, and no one would believe him if he tried to explain. He moved in with his daughter in California, selling his house remotely, never returning to pack his things. But even in California, the doubt followed him. Every elderly person he met could be an imposter. Every voice on the phone could be mimicked. Every identity could be stolen and worn like a mask. His daughter thought he was developing paranoia, maybe dementia. She suggested he see someone, talk about his experiences. But how could he explain that the paranoia was justified? That there really were people out there stealing identities so completely that even family members couldn't tell the difference? 6 months after leaving Millbrook, Earl received a package. No return address. Inside was a photo album. Every picture was of him. Earl at the grocery store in California. Earl at his daughter's house. Earl walking in the park. But in each photo there was something wrong. The Earl in the pictures was smiling when he knew he hadn't been. Wearing clothes he didn't own. Standing in places he'd never been. The last photo showed 2 Earls side by side. One was him. The other was someone who looked exactly like him, wearing his face, his clothes, his wedding ring. On the back of the photo was written, "Which one is real?" Earl burned the album. But the question remained. His daughter found him the next morning, still sitting by the cold fireplace, staring at the ashes. "Dad? Are you okay?" He looked up at her, studied her face, her concerned expression, the way she held herself. "What's our code word?" he asked. She sighed. "Dad, not this again. Please. Butterfly. Our word is butterfly. You made me choose it. After you left Wisconsin." It was correct, but codes could be learned. Information could be extracted. Earl never stopped doubting. Every person became suspect. Every interaction potentially false. The work that Gladys and Estelle had begun had succeeded in a way they probably never intended. They had destroyed his ability to trust in the basic reality of human identity. Late at night, Earl would sometimes wonder if he was still himself. If somewhere out there, another Earl was living his life better than he ever had. Being a better father, a better grandfather. The real Earl, while he was just an imposter who had forgotten he was pretending. The thought would wake him in a cold sweat, and he would stare at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for signs that he was someone else wearing Earl's face. "Who are you?" he would whisper to his reflection. The reflection never answered. But sometimes, just sometimes, he could swear it smiled a moment after he had stopped. The dogwood trees were in full bloom along Sycamore Street when Officer Virgil received the wellness check request. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early April, and the small town of Riverside, Kentucky, was experiencing one of those perfect spring days that made winter seem like a distant nightmare. The temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees, and the air was filled with the sound of lawn mowers and children playing after school. Unit 4, we have a wellness check request at 892 Sycamore Street. Neighbor is concerned about an elderly resident who hasn't been seen in several days. Officer Virgil had been with the Riverside Police Department for 19 years, and wellness checks were a routine part of his patrol duties. In a town where nearly a third of the population was over 65, checking on elderly residents was as common as traffic stops. Unit 4 responding, Virgil said into his radio. What's the resident's name? Estelle Blackwood, age 81, lives alone. Neighbor reporting is Gladys Newcomb from 894 Sycamore. Virgil knew the neighborhood well. It was one of the older sections of Riverside, built in the 1950s when the local tobacco industry was booming. The houses were modest but well-maintained, with the large yards and mature trees that provided shade from the Kentucky sun. As he turned onto Sycamore Street, Virgil could see Gladys Newcomb standing in her front yard, obviously waiting for him. Gladys was a woman in her early 70s, wearing a floral house dress and gardening gloves. She started walking toward his patrol car before he had even parked. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Gladys said, her voice tight with worry. "I'm really concerned about Estelle. This isn't like her at all." Virgil got out of his car, notepad in hand. "When did you last see Mrs. Blackwood?" "Thursday morning." 5 days ago. She was in her garden, working on her roses like she does every morning. But I haven't seen her since, and she hasn't picked up her newspapers. Gladys pointed to the house next door, where Virgil could indeed see several newspapers accumulated on the front porch. "Have you tried calling her or knocking on her door?" "Of course I have," Gladys said, a note of irritation creeping into her voice. "I've been knocking every day since Saturday. I've called her phone dozens of times. Nothing. An officer, Estelle, and I have been neighbors for 23 years. She always tells me when she's going somewhere, even if it's just to the grocery store." Virgil studied the house at 892 Sycamore Street. It was a single-story ranch with yellow siding and white trim. The lawn was starting to look overgrown, unusual for this neighborhood where lawn care was practically a competitive sport. The curtains were drawn on all the windows he could see. "Does Mrs. Blackwood have any family nearby? Anyone who might know where she is?" Gladys shook her head. "Her husband, Harold, died 8 years ago. They never had children. She has a nephew in Louisville, but they're not close. Homer, I think his name is. She mentioned him once or twice, but I don't think she's seen him in years." Virgil walked toward Estelle's house, Gladys following close behind. The front door was solid wood, painted dark green. Virgil knocked firmly. "Mrs. Blackwood. This is Officer Virgil with the Riverside Police Department. We're just checking to make sure you're all right." Silence. He knocked again, harder this time. "Mrs. Blackwood, if you can hear me, please come to the door or call out." Still nothing. Virgil walked around the side of the house, peering through gaps in the curtains. The house appeared dark inside. In the backyard, he found Estelle's prized rose garden. The roses were beginning to wilt from lack of water, something Gladys confirmed was completely out of character. "She loves those roses more than anything," Gladys said. "Waters them every single day, rain or shine. She would never let them get like this." The back door was locked, as were all the windows Virgil could check. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of any disturbance, but something felt wrong. The accumulated newspapers, the wilting roses, the drawn curtains. It all suggested that Estelle hadn't been home for days. "I'm going to have to enter the house," Virgil told Gladys, "for her safety." "Oh, thank God, I've been so worried." Virgil returned to his patrol car to call for backup, standard procedure for entering a residence during a wellness check. While he waited, he asked Gladys more questions about Estelle. What's her health like? Any medical conditions? "She's remarkably healthy for her age," Gladys said. "Still drives herself to the grocery store and church. She had a hip replacement 2 years ago, but she recovered completely. Takes medication for blood pressure, but that's about it." "Any signs of confusion or memory problems?" "None at all, sharp as a tack. She does the crossword puzzle every morning and reads at least 2 books a week. We play bridge together every Wednesday with some other ladies from church." "And she missed this week's game?" "Yes, didn't call or anything, just didn't show up. That's when I really started to worry. Officer Clarence arrived as backup within 10 minutes. He was younger than Virgil, only 5 years on the force, but reliable and thorough. Together they approached the front door. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is the police. We're concerned for your safety and are going to enter your home," Virgil announced loudly. They tried the door handle, locked. Virgil checked under the doormat and in the obvious hiding spots for a spare key, but found nothing. "Gladys, do you know if she keeps a spare key anywhere?" "She used to keep one under that ceramic frog by the steps, but she moved it after there were some break-ins in town last year. I'm not sure where she keeps it now." Virgil made the decision to force entry. Using a pry bar from his patrol car, he carefully worked the door open, trying to minimize damage. The door swung inward, revealing a dark foyer. "Mrs. Blackwood, Police Department." The house was silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the living room. Virgil and Clarence entered carefully, hands on their weapons but not drawn. The smell hit them immediately. Not the smell of death, which Virgil had unfortunately encountered before, but something else. Stale air, rotting food, and something chemical like cleaning products. The living room was tidy but dusty, as if it hadn't been disturbed in days. Family photos covered the mantel and side tables. Estelle and her late husband at various stages of their life together. The television was off. The remote control placed precisely on the coffee table. They moved to the kitchen. Here, they found the source of the rotting smell. A half-eaten sandwich on the counter covered in mold. A cup of coffee sat beside it, a film of mold floating on the surface. Virgil checked the date on the milk in the refrigerator. It had expired 6 days ago. "She was interrupted during a meal," Clarence observed. "Just got up and left?" But that didn't explain the chemical smell, which was stronger now. Virgil followed it down the hallway toward the bedrooms. The master bedroom door was closed. He knocked. "Mrs. Blackwood?" No response. He opened the door. The bedroom was in chaos. Clothes were strewn across the floor. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled. But it was the master bathroom that made Virgil's blood run cold. The bathtub was full of water, but the water was a murky brown color. Floating in it were what looked like clumps of hair, gray hair, a lot of it. On the counter were several bottles of hair dye, opened and spilled. The sink was stained with dark dye. A pair of scissors lay on the floor. "What the hell?" Clarence muttered. Virgil examined the scene more carefully. There was no sign of blood, no indication of violence. But the amount of hair in the bathtub was disturbing. It looked like someone had cut off all their hair and then tried to dye what was left. They searched the rest of the house. The spare bedroom was undisturbed, as was the small room Estelle used as a library. But in the basement they found something even more puzzling. The basement was unfinished, used mainly for storage. But in one corner, someone had set up a makeshift living area. A sleeping bag on an air mattress, a battery-powered lantern, several jugs of water, and boxes of non-perishable food. It looked like someone had been preparing to hide down here. Or someone was hiding down here, Clarence suggested. But who? And where were they now? They returned upstairs to find Gladys had entered the house, despite being told to wait outside. "Did you find her? Is she all right?" "She's not here," Virgil said. "Gladys, I need you to think carefully. Has Estelle mentioned anyone visiting recently? Any problems with anyone?" Gladys thought for a moment. "Well, there was something strange. About 2 weeks ago, she mentioned that someone had been calling her, claiming to be from Medicare or Social Security or something. She said they were very pushy, asking lots of personal questions. She was worried it was a scam. Did she report it?" "I don't think so. She just stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize." "But then what?" "This is probably nothing, but last week, Tuesday, I think, I saw someone at her door. A younger woman, maybe 40s or 50s. Dark hair. She was here for maybe an hour." "Did Estelle mention this visitor?" "No, but I didn't ask. I try not to be nosy." Virgil was about to respond when his radio crackled. "Unit 4, we have a situation you need to know about. We just received a call from Riverside General Hospital. They have an elderly woman who was brought in 3 days ago. No identification. She's been mostly unconscious, but she just woke up and is claiming her name is Estelle Blackwood." Virgil and Clarence exchanged glances. "We're on our way," Virgil said into his radio. He turned to Gladys. "We may have found her. I'll let you know as soon as we confirm it's her." The drive to Riverside General took only 10 minutes, but Virgil's mind was racing. If Estelle had been in the hospital for 3 days, who had cut their hair in her bathroom? Who had set up the hiding spot in her basement? At the hospital, they were directed to the 3rd floor, where a doctor. Patel met them. "She was brought in Saturday evening by ambulance, doctor," Patel explained as they walked. "Found wandering on Highway 68, about 5 miles outside of town. She was confused, dehydrated, and her hair had been crudely cut and dyed black. No identification, no phone, nothing." "How is she now?" "Better. The confusion seems to be clearing. She's been asking for someone named Gladys. Says she's her neighbor." They entered the hospital room to find an elderly woman propped up in bed. Virgil almost didn't recognize her. Her hair, which Gladys had described as silver and always perfectly styled, was now short, choppy, and dyed an uneven black. She had bruises on her arms and a cut on her forehead that had been stitched. "Mrs. Blackwood? I'm Officer Virgil. Your neighbor Gladys has been worried about you." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, thank God, no one here believed me. They kept saying I was confused, that I didn't know my own name." "Can you tell me what happened?" Estelle's hands trembled as she spoke. "It was that woman. The one who came to my house. She said she was from the Senior Services Department checking on elderly residents who lived alone. She seemed so nice, so official. She had a clipboard and a badge." "When was this?" "Tuesday, last Tuesday afternoon. She asked if she could come in, said she needed to assess my living situation for some kind of program. I let her in. We sat in the living room, and she asked me questions about my health, my finances, my family. Then she offered to make us some tea." Estelle paused, her face paling at the memory. "That's the last thing I remember clearly. After the tea, everything gets foggy. I remember being in a car. I remember someone cutting my hair while I was too weak to stop them. I remember being in my own basement, but it felt like a dream." "Do you remember anything about the woman? What she looked like?" "She was maybe 50, brown hair pulled back in a bun, glasses, very professional looking. She said her name was, What was it? Something with an H. Helen? No, Homer. She said her name was Miss. Homer Virgil felt a chill. Homer, are you sure? Yes, definitely. Miss Homer from Senior Services. Why? Virgil chose his words carefully. Mrs. Blackwood, you mentioned to Gladys that you have a nephew named Homer. Estelle looked confused. I do? I don't have any nephews. Harold had a nephew named Homer, but he died in a car accident 15 years ago. You're certain? Of course I'm certain. We went to his funeral in Louisville. Virgil exchanged another look with Clarence. Someone had been impersonating a dead relative, or at least using his name. But why? Mrs. Blackwood, the woman who came to your house, did she take anything? I don't know. I can't remember much after the tea. But wait. Estelle's eyes widened. My lockbox, I kept it in my bedroom closet. It had all my important papers. Birth certificate, Harold's death certificate, the deed to the house, our social security cards. I remember her asking about it. I told her about it when she was asking about my documents for the Senior Services program. Virgil stepped out to make a call to the station, asking them to run a check on any recent reports of someone claiming to be from Senior Services. There were none. The county's actual Senior Services department confirmed they hadn't sent anyone to do home visits in weeks. When he returned to the room, Estelle was still talking to Clarence. There was someone else, she was saying, in the basement. I remember now, another woman, older. She kept calling me by the wrong name. She called me Gladys. She called you Gladys? Your neighbor's name? Yes, she kept saying, Gladys, you need to drink this. Gladys, we're going to take good care of you. I tried to tell her I was Estelle, but she wouldn't listen. Or maybe I couldn't speak. It's also confused. Virgil's radio crackled again. It was dispatch. Unit 4. We have another situation. A woman just walked into the station claiming to be Estelle Blackwood. She says someone has stolen her identity and is in the hospital pretending to be her. Virgil stared at the elderly woman in the hospital bed, then at his radio. 2 women claiming to be Estelle Blackwood. He keyed his radio. Can you describe the woman at the station? Elderly female, approximately 80 years old, silver hair, wearing a floral dress. She has identification, driver's license, social security card, Medicare card, all in the name of Estelle Blackwood. She's very agitated, saying someone kidnapped her several days ago. The woman in the hospital bed, the one with the badly dyed black hair, gripped Virgil's arm. That's her. That's the woman who was in my basement. The older one. She's pretending to be me. Virgil tried to process this. Ma'am, you just told me the woman in your basement was calling you Gladys. Yes, but maybe she was practicing. Maybe she was learning to be me? Estelle's voice rose in panic. Officer, you have to believe me. I'm the real Estelle Blackwood. I've lived in that house for 30 years. Ask me anything about the neighborhood, about my life. Where did you and Harold get married? First Baptist Church of Riverside, June 15, 1962. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony. We had our reception at the Riverside Country Club. Virgil made a note. These were details that could be verified, but they were also things that could be learned from public records or conversation. I need to go to the station, Virgil told Clarence. Stay with her. Don't let anyone else in this room until I get back. Virgil drove to the police station, his mind racing. In his 19 years on the force, he'd never encountered anything like this. 2 women, both claiming to be the same person. One with identification, one without. One with silver hair as the real Estelle should have. One with badly dyed black hair. At the station, He found the second woman in an interview room with Detective Holmes. She looked exactly as Gladys had described Estelle, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a floral dress that looked like something from her closet. She was clutching a handbag and appeared to have been crying. "Oh, thank goodness," she said when Virgil entered. "Officer, I've been held captive in my own home for days. These women, they drugged me, kept me in my basement. They were trying to steal my identity. Can you tell me what happened?" This Estelle's story was similar but different. "It was last Tuesday. A woman came to my door claiming to be from Senior Services. I let her in. She seemed so official. But as soon as I turned my back, someone else came in. An older woman. They forced me to drink something that made me dizzy. They kept me in my basement for days, barely feeding me. They asked me all sorts of questions about my life, my bank accounts, my history. How did you escape? This morning, they were both upstairs. I could hear them arguing about something. The older one had forgotten to lock the basement door properly. I managed to get out and run to my neighbor's house, but no one was home. I was afraid to go back to my house, so I came straight here." Virgil studied her carefully. "Your neighbor Gladys says she hasn't seen you since Thursday morning." "Thursday? That's when I was in my garden. They took me that afternoon. But you just said they took you Tuesday." The woman's face flushed. I'm confused about the days. Being drugged, being kept in the dark. It's all jumbled. Can you tell me your husband's nephew's name?" "Homer. He lives in Louisville. We're not close. Is he alive?" "Of course he's alive. Why wouldn't he be?" This contradicted what the woman in the hospital had said, that Homer had died 15 years ago. One of them was lying, but which one? Virgil excused himself and called Gladys. "I need you to come to the station. We need your help identifying the real Estelle." While waiting for Gladys, Virgil had both women's fingerprints taken, but when they ran them through the system, neither had any records on file. Estelle Blackwood had never been arrested, never worked in a job requiring fingerprinting, never been in the military. Gladys arrived within 20 minutes. Virgil brought her to observe the woman in the interview room through a one-way mirror. "Is that Estelle?" he asked. Gladys studied the woman carefully. "She looks like Estelle. The dress is definitely hers. I was with her when she bought it at Penny's last month. But what? Something's off. The way she's sitting. Estelle has a bad hip, her right hip. She always favors her left side when she sits. This woman is sitting perfectly balanced." Virgil made a note. "Anything else?" "Her hands." "May I see her hands?" Virgil had the woman in the interview room hold up her hands, pretending to examine her jewelry through the mirror. "Those aren't Estelle's hands," Gladys said firmly. "Estelle has a scar on her left palm from a gardening accident years ago. She sliced it on a broken pot. This woman's hands have no scar." They brought Gladys to the hospital to see the other woman. As soon as Gladys entered the room, the woman with the dyed hair began crying. "Gladys! Oh, Gladys, thank God. Tell them who I am. Tell them I'm really Estelle." Gladys approached slowly. Despite the dyed hair and the bruises, she studied the woman's face carefully. Then she took her left hand and turned it over. There, across the palm, was a distinctive scar. "This is Estelle," Gladys said. "This is my friend." The real Estelle sobbed with relief, but this raised even more questions. Who was the woman at the police station? And more importantly, why was she impersonating Estelle? Virgil returned to the station with this information. When he confronted the imposter with Gladys's identification, the woman's demeanor changed completely. The tears stopped. She sat up straighter, and she smiled. "Well," she said, her voice different now, younger sounding. I suppose the game is up. Who are you? My name is Helen Morrison, and before you ask, no, I'm not from Senior Services. Why were you impersonating Mrs. Blackwood? Helen laughed. Impersonating. I preferred to think of it as borrowing. Estelle has such a nice life, a paid-off house, Social Security checks, a pension from her husband. She doesn't need all of that at her age. So, this was about money? Everything's about money, officer. Do you know how hard it is to survive on minimum wage? I've been working since I was 16, and what do I have to show for it? Nothing. Meanwhile, people like Estelle sit in their paid-off houses, collecting checks for doing nothing. So, you decided to steal her identity. I decided to become her. There's a difference. Who was the other woman? The one who came to Estelle's door? Helen's smile widened. Oh, that would be my mother. Dear old Mom, she's probably long gone by now. Virgil immediately put out an APB for an older woman, possibly in her 70s, who might be connected to Helen Morrison. But Helen refused to give her mother's name or description. She's very good at disappearing, Helen said. She's been doing this a lot longer than I have. Doing what exactly? Finding lonely old people. Learning about them. Becoming them. She taught me everything I know. The investigation revealed that Helen Morrison was actually Helen Holson, keeping with the Agatha Christie theme, 52 years old, with a long history of fraud and identity theft. She had been released from prison just 6 months earlier. Her mother was identified as Gladys Holson, 71, also with an extensive criminal record. But when police went to search Estelle's house more thoroughly, they found something that complicated the situation even further. In the basement, hidden behind some boxes, they found the body of an elderly woman. She had been dead for at least a week. She had silver hair, was wearing clothing that looked like it came from Estelle's closet, and in her pocket was a wallet containing identification for Estelle Blackwood. But the real Estelle was alive in the hospital. So who was this dead woman? Dental records eventually identified her as Dorothy Hutchins, 79, who had been reported missing from a nursing home in Indiana 3 weeks earlier. She suffered from dementia and had wandered away from the facility during an outdoor activity. The pieces slowly came together. Helen and her mother Gladys had found Dorothy, probably confused and wandering. They had brought her to Estelle's house, dressed her in Estelle's clothes, given her Estelle's identification. The plan, it seemed, was to have Dorothy's body eventually be found and identified as Estelle, while Helen took over Estelle's life. But something had gone wrong. Dorothy had died earlier than expected. The coroner determined it was from natural causes, a stroke. And the real Estelle had escaped before they could fully execute their plan. "Where's your mother now?" Virgil asked Helen during another interrogation. "I don't know. You said she was calling Estelle by the wrong name. She was calling her Gladys." Helen laughed. Mother always had trouble keeping track of who was who. We've done this so many times, in so many places. After a while, all the old ladies blend together. The search for Gladys Holson continued for weeks. They found evidence that she and Helen had been running this scheme across multiple states for years, always targeting elderly women who lived alone, always trying to take over their lives completely. In Estelle's house, they found notebooks filled with observations about her daily routine, her mannerisms, her speech patterns. Helen had been studying her for weeks before making her move, probably watching from the empty house across the street that was for sale. They also found similar notebooks about other women. Margaret from Memphis, Ruth from Raleigh, Agnes from Asheville. Phone calls to these cities revealed that all 3 women had disappeared in the past year, and in each case, Someone claiming to be them had sold their houses and vanished with the proceeds. The real Estelle was released from the hospital after a week. She couldn't return to her house, not with the memory of being held captive there, not with Dorothy's body having been in her basement. She moved in temporarily with Gladys. "I don't understand," Estelle said one evening, as she and Gladys sat on Gladys's porch, looking at her empty house next door. How could they think they could get away with it? How could Helen think she could just become me? Gladys didn't have an answer, but she held her friend's hand, the one with the scar that had proven her identity. The investigation continued. Helen was charged with kidnapping, identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, even though Dorothy's death had been natural. She was facing life in prison, but her mother, Gladys Holson, was never found. 3 weeks after Helen's arrest, Virgil received a package at the police station. No return address, postmarked from Chicago. Inside was a photo of 2 elderly women sitting on a bench in what looked like a park. One was clearly Gladys Holson, though her hair was now dyed red and she was wearing different style clothing. The other woman looked familiar, but Virgil couldn't place her. On the back of the photo was written, "Martha and her new friend." Aren't they lovely together? Virgil ran the photo through facial recognition. The second woman was identified as Martha Connolly, 83, from Milwaukee. He called the Milwaukee police. Martha Connolly had been reported missing by her nephew 2 weeks ago. She lived alone, had early-stage dementia, and had vanished from her home without taking anything with her. The Milwaukee police checked Martha's house. Someone was living there, claiming to be Martha. She had Martha's ID, knew details about Martha's life, and several neighbors vouched that it was her. But when they looked closer, tested her with questions only the real Martha would know, the woman fled. She was never caught. The pattern continued. Every few weeks, Virgil would receive a photo from a different city. Always 2 elderly women. Always one who turned out to be Gladys Holson in disguise. Always one who was reported missing soon after. It became clear that Gladys was continuing the scheme alone, but with a twist. She wasn't just stealing identities anymore. She was collecting the women themselves, taking them somewhere, keeping them for reasons unknown. 6 months after Helen's arrest, Virgil was called to another wellness check. This time in the next town over. An elderly woman hadn't been seen in days. The house was empty, except for a notebook left on the kitchen table. Inside were detailed notes about dozens of elderly women across the Midwest. Their routines, their finances, their health conditions, their family situations. At the bottom of the last page was a note. "Officer Virgil, you stopped Helen, but she was sloppy. She got emotional, wanted to hurt them because she was angry about her own life. I don't hurt them, I collect them. I give them new lives, better lives. Check the news from Detroit. G.H." The news from Detroit reported that a nursing home had discovered that 5 of its residents were not who they claimed to be. 5 elderly women with dementia had been replaced by other elderly women with dementia. The families hadn't noticed because they rarely visited. The staff hadn't noticed because dementia patients often had confusion about their identities anyway. The real residents were found in an abandoned warehouse, being cared for by someone who had set up a makeshift nursing facility. They were unharmed, but confused. None could explain how they had gotten there, or who had been caring for them. But on the wall of the warehouse was a message. "I take better care of them than their families ever did." The FBI got involved at this point. The scope of Gladys Holson's activities was beyond what local law enforcement could handle. They discovered a network of properties across the Midwest where elderly women were being held, moved, and exchanged like pieces in some incomprehensible game. But Gladys herself remained elusive. She had perfected the art of becoming invisible by becoming everyone. Any elderly woman could be her, any grandmother at the grocery store, any resident at a nursing home, any widow living alone. Estelle eventually moved to a senior living community in Florida, unable to stay in Riverside with all its memories. Before she left, she said something to Virgil that haunted him. "I still have nightmares where I look in the mirror and see Helen's face looking back at me. Or worse, I see my own face, but no, it's not really me wearing it." She didn't just try to steal my identity, officer. She made me doubt that my identity was ever real in the first place. Gladys Newcomb, Estelle's former neighbor, became increasingly paranoid after her friend left. She installed security cameras, changed her locks monthly, and started requiring anyone who came to her door to answer personal questions only she would know the answers to. "You can't be too careful," she told Virgil during one of his check-ins. "That woman is still out there, and she knows everything about us." She was in Estelle's house for days, going through her things. She probably knows about me, too. Sometimes I wonder if she's watching me right now, learning how to be me. One day, Gladys called Virgil in a panic. "There's someone in my garden," she said, "an elderly woman. She's just standing there, looking at my roses." Virgil rushed over, but by the time he arrived, the woman was gone. There were footprints in the garden, and one of Gladys's prize roses had been cut. That evening, Gladys received a package. Inside was the cut rose and a note. "You take such good care of these, just like you took care of Estelle. Such a good friend, such a good identity." Your admirer Gladys moved in with her daughter in Texas the next week. The house at 892 Sycamore Street stood empty for months. No one wanted to buy a house where someone had been held captive, where a body had been found. Eventually, it was demolished, and the lot remained vacant. But Virgil sometimes drove by, late at night, and could swear he saw an elderly woman standing where the garden used to be, tending to roses that were no longer there. The FBI task force assigned to the Gladys Holson case had set up a command center in Louisville, tracking her movements across 7 states. 6 months had passed since Helen's arrest, and the scope of what they were uncovering defied belief. Agent Edna, a specialist in identity theft and elder fraud, had created a map with red pins marking confirmed sightings and blue pins marking suspected activity. The map looked like it had contracted measles. Officer Virgil had been seconded to the task force as a consultant, his experience with the original case proving valuable. He sat in the Louisville office, staring at photographs spread across a conference table. Each photo showed elderly women, all taken in different cities, all showing Gladys Holson with someone new. "She's accelerating," Agent Edna observed, studying the timeline. In the beginning, she and Helen would take months to study and replace one person. Now, she's moving every few weeks. "She's not replacing them anymore," Virgil pointed out. "She's collecting them." But why? The answer came from an unexpected source. Helen Morrison, serving her life sentence, requested to speak with investigators. Virgil and Agent Edna visited her at the Kentucky State Women's Prison. Helen had aged years and months. Her hair, which she had dyed to look elderly, was now growing out in its natural brown with gray streaks. She looked tired, defeated. "Mother's lost her mind," Helen said without preamble. "I've been getting letters. Not directly from her, she's too smart for that. But I know her handwriting, her way of thinking." She produced several letters from her cell. They were supposedly from different people, pen pals from a church program. But Helen pointed out the similarities in handwriting, the recurring phrases, the coded messages. "She's building something," Helen said. "She calls it her garden of forgotten flowers. She thinks she's saving them. Saving them from what? From being forgotten, from dying alone, from families who don't care. Helen laughed bitterly. Mother was in a nursing home herself once, you know. About 15 years ago, she'd had a fall, needed rehabilitation. Medicare only covered 30 days, and I couldn't afford more. She spent 2 months in a state facility. Helen's eyes grew distant. She said it was like being erased. No one knew her name. The staff called everyone Sweetie or Honey. Families visited less and less. People died in the night and were replaced by morning like they'd never existed. So, she started stealing identities? No, at first she just started visiting nursing homes, pretending to be people's relatives so they'd have visitors. She'd learn about them, their lives, their stories. She said she was keeping their memories alive. When did it change? When she realized she could become them. Really become them. Not just take their social security checks, but live their lives better than they were living them. She convinced herself she was honoring them. Virgil studied the letters. One phrase kept recurring. The garden grows. What garden? He asked. Helen shrugged. I don't know. Toward the end, before you caught us, she kept talking about finding the perfect place for her garden. Somewhere she could tend to all her flowers. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. A report from rural Indiana about an abandoned psychiatric hospital that had shown signs of activity. Local teenagers exploring the building had reported seeing lights and hearing voices. When state police investigated, they found evidence of recent habitation but no one present. What they did find were hospital beds, arranged in rows. Medical equipment, outdated but functional. A kitchen stocked with enough food for dozens of people. And on the walls, photographs of elderly women. Hundreds of them. The FBI descended on the facility. Among the photographs, they identified 17 women who had been reported missing over the past year. But there were so many more unidentified faces. In what had been the administrator's office, they found detailed files on each woman. Medical histories, family trees, personal histories going back decades. It was an archive of forgotten lives meticulously documented. But the women themselves were gone. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed a convoy of 3 vans leaving the area 2 days before the police arrived. The vans were registered to a medical transport company that didn't exist. The trail led to Missouri, where similar reports emerged about an abandoned retirement home showing signs of activity. By the time law enforcement arrived, it was empty except for more photographs, more files, and a message painted on the wall. They are not missing. They are not forgotten. They are becoming who they were meant to be. Virgil couldn't sleep. The case consumed him. He studied every photograph, every file, looking for patterns. These weren't random selections. Gladys was choosing specific women. All were over 70. All had been reported missing by distant relatives or neighbors, not immediate family. All had some form of cognitive decline, but were not completely incapacitated. Then he noticed something else. In each file, Gladys had written personal notes, not about the women's current states, but about who they had been. A retired teacher who had taught thousands of students, a nurse who had delivered hundreds of babies, a librarian who had inspired a love of reading in her community. She's not collecting them randomly, Virgil told Agent Edna. She's collecting women with significant life histories. Women who contributed to society but are now forgotten. But what is she doing with them? The answer came from the most unexpected source. Gladys Newcomb, Estelle's former neighbor now living in Texas, called Virgil directly. I got a postcard, she said, her voice shaking. It's from Estelle. But Estelle's in Florida. I just talked to her yesterday. The postcard showed a scenic view of the Ozark Mountains. The message, in handwriting that looked like Estelle's, read, Dear Gladys, I'm finally home. The garden is beautiful. You were right about the roses. They need daily attention. Your friend always, Estelle. But Estelle was in Florida. Virgil had confirmed it himself. More postcards surfaced. Families across the Midwest reported receiving cards from missing relatives, all postmarked from the same region of the Ozarks, all mentioning a garden. The FBI triangulated the postmarks to a 100-square-mile area of rural Missouri. Satellite imagery showed numerous abandoned properties, old farms, defunct summer camps, closed resorts. Any of them could be Gladys's garden. The search took weeks. Local law enforcement, FBI agents, and volunteers combed through the mountainous terrain. They found traces, abandoned campsites, discarded medical supplies, tire tracks leading nowhere. Then a forest ranger reported something odd. An old tuberculosis sanatorium, abandoned since the 1960s, had a new access road cut through the forest. The road was carefully hidden, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The sanatorium sat on 300 acres of isolated land, surrounded by national forest. It had been built in 1923 and abandoned in 1967 when tuberculosis treatments advanced. The massive brick building could have housed 200 patients in its heyday. Surveillance drones showed activity, people moving in the gardens, laundry hanging on lines, smoke from chimneys. But something was strange about the movements. Everyone moved slowly, carefully, like they were elderly. The raid was planned for dawn. 50 agents, local police, and emergency medical personnel surrounded the facility. Virgil was with the lead team, despite not being FBI. Agent Edna had insisted his presence might help if they encountered confused elderly victims. As they approached the building, an elderly woman emerged from the front door. She was wearing a white nurse's uniform from the 1950s. She smiled at the approaching agents. "Welcome to Sunshine Acres," she said. "Visiting hours are from 2 to 4. It was Gladys Holson. But as they got closer, Virgil realized something was wrong. This woman was too old to be Gladys. She had to be 90 if she was a day. But the face structure, the eyes... "Hello, Officer Virgil," she said in Gladys's voice. "I've been expecting you." The agents moved to arrest her, but she held up a hand. "Please, you'll frighten them. Let me show you what I've built. Let me show you my garden." Against protocol, Agent Edna allowed it, but with a full tactical team accompanying them. The inside of the sanatorium had been transformed. The walls were freshly painted in soft pastels. The floors were clean. It smelled of lavender and fresh bread. And in the main ward, converted into a communal living space, were 43 elderly women. They were playing cards, knitting, reading, chatting. When they saw the visitors, they smiled and waved. One called out, "Are you here for the tea social?" Virgil recognized faces from the missing persons files. Dorothy Hutchins, who they thought had died in Estelle's basement, alive and serving tea to another woman. Margaret Connolly from Milwaukee, Ruth Patterson from Raleigh. All the missing women, but transformed. "They're all here voluntarily," Gladys said. "Ask them. They'll tell you." Agent Edna approached one of the women, Martha Connolly from Milwaukee. "Ma'am, are you Martha Connolly?" The woman smiled. "I used to be. Now I'm Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm writing my memoirs." Another woman interjected, "And I'm Amelia Earhart. I'm planning my next flight." Each woman had assumed a different identity, famous women from history, and they seemed happy, content in their delusions. "You've brainwashed them," Edna accused Gladys. "Have I?" Gladys asked. "Or have I given them what every nursing home takes away, the right to be someone important?" She led them to another room, set up as a medical facility. It was clean, well stocked. Medication schedules were posted on the wall. Each woman's real name was listed along with their chosen name. I give them their medications, I feed them, I bathe them, I listen to their stories, I validate their importance. How is that different from what any care facility does, except I don't charge $8,000 a month? You kidnapped them, Virgil said. Did I? Dorothy was wandering on a highway. Martha had been missing from her home for days before I found her. Ruth's family hadn't visited in 2 years. I gave them purpose. In another room they found the real horror. Bodies, 5 of them, in various states of decomposition. But Gladys seemed unbothered. They died naturally, she said. Agnes had a heart attack. Patricia had a stroke. They died surrounded by friends who knew their chosen names, their chosen stories. They died being someone important. You didn't report their deaths. That's a crime. Report to whom? Families who forgot them. A system that had already erased them? The FBI began the process of identifying and processing the women. But something unexpected happened. Many of them didn't want to leave. They became agitated when told they had to return to their families or care facilities. Please don't make me go back, one woman begged Virgil. She was clutching a notebook where she'd been writing poetry under the name Emily Dickinson. Here, I'm somebody. There, I'm just another old woman waiting to die. Social workers and medical professionals were brought in. The women were evaluated. Most had moderate to severe dementia, but their physical health was generally good. Gladys had been caring for them in her own twisted way. The legal situation was complex. Gladys had committed numerous crimes: kidnapping, identity theft, failure to report deaths, fraud. But she had also been providing care to women who had been abandoned or forgotten by the system. During her interrogation, Gladys was unrepentant. I gave them what every old person wants: to matter, to be remembered, to be important. She looked directly at Virgil. You think I'm a monster. But I've spent time in the nursing homes where these women would have died. Sat in beds soiled for hours, fed assembly line meals, addressed by disease instead of name. I gave them dignity. You gave them delusions. I gave them happiness. How many of them were happy when I found them? The women were gradually returned to their families or placed in appropriate care facilities. But the transition was difficult. Several died within weeks, as if being returned to their real identities had broken something vital in them. Dorothy Hutchins, who had been living as Florence Nightingale, was placed in a nursing home in Indianapolis. Virgil visited her a month later. She was sitting in a wheelchair in a sterile hallway, staring at nothing. Dorothy? He said. She looked up at him with empty eyes. That's not my name. I don't know who Dorothy is. Florence is gone. I'm nobody now. She died 2 weeks later. The investigation revealed that Gladys had been planning this for years. She had used the money stolen from victims to fund her sanctuary. She had recruited several former nursing home workers who had become disillusioned with the system. They had helped her transport and care for the women. One of these workers, a former nurse named Patricia Holmes, provided insight into Gladys's motivations. She really believed she was saving them, Patricia said. She'd spend hours with each woman, learning their histories, their dreams. Then she'd help them become who they'd always wanted to be. A woman who'd been a secretary her whole life became a famous author. A housewife became a senator. It was delusional, but they were happy. And you thought this was right? I thought it was better than what they had. Have you seen the average nursing home, the average dementia ward? At least with Gladys, they died thinking they mattered. Gladys was charged with 43 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of failure to report a death, and numerous counts of fraud and identity theft. But during her trial, something unexpected happened. Several of the women she had collected testified on her behalf. Despite their dementia, despite the crimes, they spoke of how she had cared for them, how she had made them feel important. One woman, who had been living as Rosa Parks in Gladys's sanctuary, stood up in court. That woman gave me more dignity in 6 months than I'd had in 5 years in a nursing home. She knew my name, she knew my story, she made me feel like I mattered. The prosecutor pointed out that Gladys had been calling her Rosa Parks, not her real name. "So what?" the woman replied. "At least she called me something other than Room 12, Bed B." Gladys was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but the case had raised uncomfortable questions about elder care in America. Several journalists investigated the conditions in the facilities where the women were returned. The reports were damning. Helen Morrison, watching from prison, wrote one final letter to Virgil. Mother was insane, but she wasn't wrong. We warehouse our elderly and wait for them to die. She gave them a fantasy, yes. But which is crueler, dying believing you're someone important or dying knowing you've been forgotten? Virgil had no answer. A year later, he was called to another wellness check. An elderly woman in a nursing home was claiming to be Gladys Holson. She insisted she had been kidnapped and replaced, that someone else was in prison wearing her face. The woman looked nothing like Gladys. She was African American, at least 80 years old with advanced dementia, but she knew details about the case that had never been made public. Details only Gladys would know. When Virgil checked with the prison, Gladys Holson was in her cell, but she smiled when told about the woman claiming to be her. "The garden continues to grow," she said. "Even in winter, some flowers bloom." The woman in the nursing home died before they could investigate further. She was buried under her own name, Margaret Washington. But the nurse who had cared for her said she had died peacefully, still insisting she was Gladys Holson, still talking about her garden of forgotten flowers. Virgil retired shortly after that. The case had broken something in him. He couldn't look at elderly people the same way. Every nursing home seemed like a warehouse. Every forgotten elder seemed like a potential victim, or perhaps a potential Gladys. On his last day, he received a postcard. It showed a garden in full bloom. On the back, in handwriting he didn't recognize, was written, "The garden never dies. It just finds new gardeners. Thank you for understanding, even if you couldn't admit it." A flower. He burned the postcard. But sometimes, late at night, he wondered if Gladys had been right about one thing. In a society that made elderly people invisible, was it really so wrong to give them new identities, even if those identities were lies? He never found an answer that satisfied him. Years later, reports surfaced of similar operations in other states. Elderly people vanishing from neglectful facilities, reappearing in communal homes where they lived as historical figures or celebrities. The FBI called them gardens, after Gladys's original. They would raid them, return the elderly to their families or facilities. But new ones kept appearing, as if Gladys had planted seeds that continued to grow. The last report Virgil read before he stopped following the case entirely was about a facility in Oregon. 40 elderly men and women, all living as former presidents and first ladies. When rescued, none wanted to leave. One man, who had been living as Franklin Roosevelt, told reporters, "I'd rather die as someone important than live as someone forgotten." The facility's operator was never caught, but surveillance footage showed an elderly woman with a watering can tending to a rose garden behind the building. She looked exactly like Estelle Blackwood, but Estelle was still in Florida. Virgil had checked. Hadn't he? 5 years had passed since the raid on the Ozark Sanatorium. Officer Virgil had been retired for 3 years, living quietly in a cabin he'd bought in the Tennessee mountains. He thought he had left the case behind, but on a humid April morning, his old partner Clarence called. "Virgil, you need to hear this. There's been another garden discovered. This one's different." Virgil didn't want to know. He'd spent too many nights wondering about Gladys Holson's twisted philosophy, about the women who died believing they were someone important. But Clarence's next words chilled him. They found Homer Virgil, the real Homer, Estelle's nephew who supposedly died 15 years ago. He's alive. Virgil drove 6 hours to Louisville, where the FBI task force had reassembled. Agent Edna was still leading the investigation, her hair now streaked with gray, her face showing the wear of chasing ghosts for half a decade. "He was in a facility in West Virginia," Edna explained, showing Virgil photographs. "Another garden, but this one specialized in men. Elderly men living as war heroes, astronauts, presidents. Homer was living as Neil Armstrong. Homer was 73 years old, suffering from moderate dementia. He had no memory of the past 15 years. His last clear memory was of visiting his Aunt Estelle and Uncle Harold in Riverside, Kentucky. Gladys must have taken him then," Edna said, "faked his death, used his identity as a cover story. He's been in various gardens ever since." But that raised more questions. If Gladys had been collecting people for 15 years, how many gardens were there? How many people were living stolen lives? The investigation expanded. The FBI created a database of all elderly people reported missing in the past 2 decades, cross-referenced with deaths that seemed suspicious. Closed casket funerals, cremations with no viewing, deaths while families were traveling. The numbers were staggering. Over 3,000 potential cases across 15 states. "This is impossible," Edna said, staring at the data. Gladys couldn't have done all this alone, even with Helen. Virgil remembered something Helen had said during one of her interviews. Mother taught others. At the time, they'd assumed she meant other criminals. But what if she meant something else? They re-interviewed Helen in prison. She looked older, frailer. The years of incarceration had worn her down. "You want to know about Mother's disciples," Helen said. It wasn't a question. Disciples? That's what she called them. The forgotten ones who understood. The elderly who saw what she was doing and wanted to help. Some were dementia patients who had moments of clarity. Others were nursing home workers who'd lost faith in the system. She taught them all. Taught them what? How to disappear. How to become someone else. How to give that gift to others. Helen laughed bitterly. She created a movement, Officer Virgil. A revolution of the forgotten. The FBI tracked down former employees of nursing homes where residents had gone missing. Many had quit shortly after the disappearances. Some had vanished themselves. One former nurse, Patricia Holmes, was found living in Montana under a different name. When confronted, she broke down. "You don't understand what it's like," she said. Watching them fade away, forgotten by everyone. Gladys showed us another way, a kinder way. Patricia revealed that there was a network, not organized, not hierarchical, but connected by a shared belief. They called themselves gardeners. They found forgotten elderly people and gave them new identities, new purposes. "How many gardeners are there?" Edna asked. "I don't know, dozens, hundreds. Once you learn to see the forgotten, you see them everywhere." The investigation uncovered gardens in 12 states. Some were elaborate, like the Ozark Sanatorium. Others were simple. A farmhouse with 4 or 5 elderly people living as a chosen family of historical figures. In each case, the elderly were well cared for physically. Medications were administered properly, meals were nutritious, but their identities had been completely overwritten. In Ohio, they found a garden where 12 elderly women were living as the wives of the 12 apostles. In Montana, a garden of famous writers, elderly people who spent their days writing stories they believed would change the world. But the most disturbing discovery came from Texas. A garden had been operating in plain sight, registered as a legitimate assisted living facility. Sunshine Manor had all the proper licenses, passed all inspections, but every resident was living under an assumed identity. The director, a woman named Margaret Thompson, had documentation for everything: admission papers, medical records, payment histories. But when the FBI dug deeper, they found that none of the residents were who their papers claimed. Margaret Thompson herself turned out to be 3 different people. The real Margaret had died 5 years ago. Her identity had been assumed by an elderly woman named Ruth. But Ruth had also died, and her identity had been taken by another woman. It was an endless chain of stolen lives. When they tried to unravel it all, they discovered something that shook even the experienced agents. Some of the elderly residents preferred their false identities. When told their real names, they became distressed, even violent. One man, living as Ernest Hemingway, tried to kill himself when told he was actually Robert Johnson, a retired plumber from Dallas. "You're taking away the only thing that makes me want to wake up," he said from his hospital bed. Robert Johnson is nobody. Ernest Hemingway matters. The legal system struggled with how to handle the cases. Many of the gardeners were elderly themselves, suffering from varying degrees of dementia. Prosecuting them seemed cruel, but leaving the gardens operational was impossible. The solution came from an unexpected source. Gladys Holson, from her prison cell, offered a proposal through her lawyer. "Let me create a legitimate garden," she proposed. "A licensed facility where elderly people can choose their identities, where being forgotten isn't the only option." The proposal was immediately rejected, but it sparked a national conversation about elder care, identity, and dignity in aging. Virgil found himself drawn back into the investigation when something personal happened. His own mother, living in a nursing home in Nashville, disappeared. She was 85, suffering from mild dementia. One day, she was in her room. The next, she was gone. The facility claimed she had been discharged to family, but Virgil had no other family. He spent weeks searching. Then a postcard arrived, his mother's handwriting, but the words were wrong. "My dear son, I'm finally free. I'm not your mother anymore. I'm Sacagawea, guiding others to freedom. Don't look for me. Remember me as I was, not as I was becoming." Virgil went to the FBI with the postcard. The postmark led them to Arkansas to another garden. But when they raided it, they found only empty beds and a message on the wall. "The seeds have scattered." The garden grows everywhere now. Over the next year, the gardens became more sophisticated. They moved constantly. They used technology to create false digital footprints. They had networks of supporters who helped them hide. The FBI estimated that at any given time, there were at least 50 gardens operating across the country, housing over 1,000 elderly people living under false identities. But the real shock came when they discovered gardens where the elderly had chosen to be there. In Vermont, they found a facility where elderly people paid to have their identities changed. A former Harvard professor was living as Albert Einstein. A retired accountant was Winston Churchill. They had signed contracts, paid fees, chosen their new lives. When authorities tried to shut it down, the ACLU got involved. If adults could legally change their names, if they could identify as different genders, Why couldn't elderly people with dementia choose to be different people entirely? The case went to the Supreme Court. The question: did elderly people with cognitive decline have the right to choose delusion over reality? During the hearings, an elderly woman named Dorothy, not her real name, she insisted, testified. "I spent 40 years as a cashier at Walmart," she said. "Nobody knew my name. Nobody cared about my story. Now I'm Eleanor Roosevelt. I matter. I have a purpose. Even if it's not real, it feels real to me. Isn't that enough?" The court ruled 5-4 that while forced identity changes were illegal, elderly people with capacity could choose alternative identities in appropriate care settings. It was a narrow ruling, full of caveats, but it legitimized what Gladys had started. Within a year, identity choice facilities began opening legally. They were highly regulated, expensive, and controversial, but they filled quickly. Gladys Holson, serving her life sentence, was interviewed by a documentary crew. "I was wrong about the method," she admitted, "but not about the need. Every elderly person deserves to die as someone who matters." Helen Morrison, in the same documentary, was less philosophical. "Mother lost her mind, but she saw something true. We throw away our elderly like garbage. At least she tried to recycle them into something beautiful." Officer Virgil never found his mother. The FBI continued searching, but she had vanished completely into the network of gardens. Occasionally, he received postcards. Different handwriting each time, but always signed Sacagawea. The messages were cryptic. "The river flows north now. The mountain has many paths. The sunset is just another sunrise." He didn't know if they were from his mother or from someone pretending to be her pretending to be Sacagawea. The layers of identity had become so tangled that truth was impossible to determine. 3 years into his search, Virgil was contacted by a woman claiming to have information about his mother. They met at a diner in rural Tennessee. The woman was elderly, probably 75, with sharp eyes and careful movements. She introduced herself as Nobody. "That's not a name," Virgil said. "It's the only honest name," she replied. "I've been so many people, I don't remember which one was real." She claimed to have been in a garden with his mother. "She was happy," Nobody said. "Happier than I'd ever seen someone in those places. She really believed she was guiding people to freedom." "Where is she now?" "I don't know. Gardens move. People move between them." "She could be anywhere, anyone." Nobody studied his face. "You're wondering if I'm her." Virgil had been wondering exactly that. The age was wrong, but with makeup, disguise. "I'm not," Nobody said, "but I could be. That's what Gladys gave us. The possibility of being anyone. The freedom from being ourselves." She left him with a warning. "Stop looking for your mother. She doesn't exist anymore. Sacagawea exists, and Sacagawea doesn't want to be found." But Virgil couldn't stop. He spent another year following leads, chasing postcards, visiting gardens, both legal and illegal. He saw hundreds of elderly people living as historical figures, celebrities, fictional characters. In each place, he looked for signs of his mother. A gesture, a phrase, a familiar laugh. But everyone was performing. Everyone was someone else. Identity had become fluid, meaningless. The breaking point came in Minnesota, a garden disguised as a legitimate memory care unit. Virgil had infiltrated it, posing as a visitor. He found an elderly woman who moved like his mother, had the same slight tilt to her head when listening. "Mom?" he whispered. She looked at him blankly. "I'm Harriet Tubman. I don't have children. I have a railroad to run." He showed her photographs of herself, of him as a child, of their family. She studied them with detached interest. "That woman looks sad," she said about a photo of herself. I'm glad I'm not her anymore." Virgil left not knowing if it was his mother or just another woman who had learned to move like her. The uncertainty broke him. He returned to Tennessee, to his cabin, but the postcards kept coming. Now they were from different historical figures: Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, all signed "Your loving mother." The FBI task force officially closed the garden investigation after the Supreme Court ruling. The legal gardens were regulated. The illegal ones were too numerous and mobile to track effectively. Agent Edna retired, exhausted by years of chasing shadows. In her final report, she wrote, "We failed to understand that this was never just about crime. It was about a fundamental failure in how we treat our elderly. Gladys Holson was a criminal, but she exposed a truth we didn't want to see, that we warehouse our elderly and wait for them to die. The gardens, legal and illegal, are a symptom of that failure." Gladys Holson died in prison 5 years after her conviction. Her last words, according to the prison chaplain, were, "The garden is eternal." Helen Morrison was released on compassionate grounds when she developed terminal cancer. She died in a hospice, insisting to the end that she was actually Gladys's daughter, not Helen at all. No one could prove otherwise. The gardens continued to proliferate. By 2030, there were an estimated 200 legal identity choice facilities and unknown hundreds of illegal gardens. The elderly disappeared into them and emerged as new people, or never emerged at all. Virgil received one final postcard on his 80th birthday. The handwriting was shaky, clearly from someone very elderly. It read, "My dear son, I am everyone and no one. I am your mother and Sacagawea and all the forgotten women who ever lived. I am dying soon, but I will die as someone who mattered. That's all any of us want. Stop looking for me. I was found long ago. Love, everyone." He never received another postcard. Years later, when Virgil developed dementia himself, his caregivers noticed something odd. He would sometimes claim to be Officer Earl, investigating a home invasion. Other times he was Clarence, processing evidence. Once, memorably, he insisted he was Gladys Holson, herself, talking about his garden of forgotten flowers. The nursing home staff thought it was just the dementia, but one young nurse, who had heard about the gardens, wondered if maybe Virgil had chosen his own way of escaping. When Virgil died at 87, he was calling himself Homer, talking about his Aunt Estelle and the house on Sycamore Street. The death certificate listed him as Virgil Patterson, retired police officer. But the nurse who held his hand as he passed heard him whisper, "I'm going to the garden now." Mother's waiting. Whether he meant his biological mother or Gladys Holson, no one could say. The house at 892 Sycamore Street in Riverside, Kentucky, stood empty for 20 years before being demolished. But locals said that on spring evenings, you could sometimes see elderly women in the overgrown garden, tending to roses that no longer existed. Gladys Newcomb, the neighbor who had first called for the wellness check, lived to be 93. She died in a legal identity choice facility, having spent her last years as Amelia Earhart. Her children were disturbed, but the staff said she had never been happier. She died believing she had flown across the ocean, the facility director said. Is that worse than dying believing you're nobody? The question remained unanswered. The last confirmed garden was discovered in Alaska in 2035. 47 elderly people living in an abandoned fishing village, all believing they were the original inhabitants of America. When rescued, none of them wanted to leave. The government finally stopped raiding gardens in 2036. The official reason was resource allocation. The unofficial reason was that no one could determine anymore what constituted identity theft when identity itself had become so fluid. Today, Historians estimate that between 1990 and 2035, over 10,000 elderly Americans disappeared into gardens. Some died there, some emerged with new identities. Some are still there, in hidden places, being tended by gardeners who themselves don't remember their original names. Officer Virgil's case files were donated to the Smithsonian, part of an exhibit on identity and aging in 21st century America. Visitors often leave confused, unable to determine whether the gardens were a crime or a kindness. The exhibit includes a quote from Gladys Holson's final letter, written the day before she died. "Every flower in my garden was once a weed that someone forgot to water. I gave them new names, new purposes. If that's a crime, then so is every nursing home that calls someone by their room number instead of their name. The only difference is, I remembered they were human." The curator notes that no one has been able to verify if Gladys actually wrote this letter, or if someone was pretending to be her. In the end, that uncertainty might have been exactly what Gladys wanted. In a world where anyone could be anyone, everyone mattered equally, or perhaps no one mattered at all. The dispatcher's voice crackled through Officer Delbert's radio at 11:47 p.m. on that October Thursday. He had been patrolling the quiet streets of Millfield, Ohio, watching autumn leaves swirl in the streetlights. "Unit 3, we have a 911 call from 447 Oak Street. Elderly female caller reports disturbing noises from the neighbor's house. She sounds extremely distressed. Unit 3 responding. Play the call for me," Delbert said, turning his patrol car toward Oak Street. The 911 recording came through his radio. "911, what's your emergency?" "My name is Norma Reed. I live at 447 Oak Street. Something terrible is happening next door at Vernon's house. I can hear, I don't know how to describe it, screaming, but also music, like someone's being hurt." "Ma'am, is someone in immediate danger?" "I don't know. Vernon lives alone since his wife died, but I hear multiple voices. Some sound young. Oh God, there's another scream. Please send someone." "We're dispatching an officer now, Mrs. Reed. Can you tell me more about what you're hearing?" "It's been going on for 2 hours. Music that starts and stops. Crying. Sometimes laughing, but it sounds wrong. Vernon's a retired music teacher. He's 68, never causes trouble. But something's very wrong." The recording ended. Delbert knew Vernon Crawford, former high school music teacher, widowed 2 years ago when Wilma died of cancer. Quiet man, kept to himself. As Delbert turned onto Oak Street, he could see Norma Reed on her porch, clutching her phone. She rushed toward his car before he'd even parked. "Officer Delbert, thank God. Listen, you can hear it from here." Delbert got out and indeed heard it. Piano music drifting from Vernon's house but played erratically. Then voices. Multiple voices. Some sounding distressed. "Mrs. Reed, when did you last see Mr. Crawford?" "This morning. He was getting his mail. Looked terrible. Hadn't shaved. Clothes wrinkled. Asked if he was okay. He just mumbled something about preparing for a concert." "A concert?" "That's what worried me. There's no concert. The school hasn't had a music program for 5 years." Delbert approached Vernon's dark blue Victorian. The porch light was off, but he could see lights flickering inside. He knocked firmly. "Mr. Crawford? Officer Delbert with Millfield Police. We've received a complaint. I need you to come to the door." The music stopped abruptly. Then footsteps, multiple sets it seemed. The door opened slightly, held by a chain. Vernon's face appeared, haggard, red-eyed, his gray hair unkempt. Officer, is there a problem? Mr. Crawford, we've had reports of disturbing noises. Are you all right? Is anyone else in there? I'm fine. Just practicing for the memorial concert. What memorial concert, sir? Vernon's eyes darted nervously. The students, from '89. Tomorrow is the anniversary. Delbert knew what he meant. October 15th, 1989. 6 students from the music program had died when their van crashed returning from a competition. Vernon was supposed to have driven them, but had called in sick. The substitute teacher who drove had fallen asleep at the wheel. Mr. Crawford, may I come in? I need to check that everyone's safe. Everyone. Vernon's voice cracked. There's no one here but me. From inside, Delbert heard a voice, young, female. Mr. Crawford, should we continue? Vernon's face went pale. That's just a recording of my old students. Sir, I need to come in now. Vernon reluctantly undid the chain. The smell hit Delbert immediately. Unwashed clothes, rotting food, and something else. Fear. The living room was chaos. Sheet music everywhere, but covered in red ink corrections, notes that made no musical sense. Multiple instruments were set up, violins, flutes, a cello, all arranged facing the piano where Vernon had been sitting. Mr. Crawford, who else is here? No one. I told you, I'm alone. But Delbert heard footsteps upstairs. He drew his weapon. Whoever is upstairs, this is the police. Come down slowly with your hands visible. Vernon grabbed his arm. No. Please, they're just kids. They're scared. What kids, Vernon? The old man started crying. I found them. After what he did to them, I couldn't leave them there. Delbert keyed his radio. Dispatch. I need backup at 445 Oak. Possible multiple victims in the house. He moved toward the stairs, Vernon following, begging him to be gentle. At the top, Delbert found 4 teenagers, 2 boys, 2 girls, all appearing to be 15 to 17 years old. They were huddled in a bedroom, terrified. But something was wrong. They were dressed in clothes from the 1980s. Their hair was styled like teenagers from that era, and they all had matching bruises on their necks. It's okay, Delbert said gently. I'm Officer Delbert. You're safe now. Can you tell me your names? The girl who looked oldest spoke. Jennifer. This is Michael, Susan, and David. Mr. Crawford saved us. Those were the names of 4 of the students who died in 1989. Saved you from what? From him, from Mr. Wallace. He kept us in his house, made us pretend to be them, the dead students. He said if we didn't play along, he'd kill us like he killed them. Delbert felt his blood cold. Norman Wallace, he was the substitute teacher who had supposedly died in the crash with the students. Wallace is alive? Vernon spoke from behind him. He never died. He staged the crash, killed those kids, and now he's been taking new kids, making them replace the ones who died. These 4 escaped 3 days ago. They came to me because they knew I'd believe them. Where is Wallace now? One of the boys, Michael, spoke up. He has 2 more, Kenny and Lisa. He makes them answer to Robert and Amy, the other 2 who died in the crash. He lives at 892 Sycamore, but he has a basement. That's where he keeps us. Delbert immediately called for multiple units and explained the situation. Within minutes, the house was surrounded by police. The teenagers were taken to safety while SWAT prepared to raid Wallace's house. Vernon sat in his living room, looking defeated. I should have driven them that night. If I hadn't called in sick. This isn't your fault, Mr. Crawford. I've been hiding them for 3 days. I didn't know what to do. Wallace has connections. He was declared dead. Who would believe he's alive and kidnapping kids to replace the ones he killed? The raid on Wallace's house revealed the horror. 2 teenagers were found locked in a soundproof basement, forced to wear 1980s clothing and answer to the names of the dead students. The basement walls were covered with photos from 1989, newspaper clippings about the crash, and disturbingly detailed information about each dead student. Norman Wallace was arrested trying to flee through the back door. He looked nothing like his old photos. Plastic surgery, different hair color, but dental records would later confirm his identity. During interrogation, Wallace revealed his delusion. He believed that if he could perfectly recreate that night in 1989, if he could drive the students home safely this time, it would undo his crime. He had been kidnapping teenagers who looked similar to his victims, forcing them to learn everything about the dead students, planning to take them on the same route on the anniversary. I was going to save them this time, he kept saying. I was going to make it right. The 6 teenagers were all runaways from different states, taken over the past 2 years. Wallace had been training them, forcing them to memorize details about the dead students' lives, teaching them to play the same instruments, even making them write in the dead students' handwriting. Vernon Crawford had recognized one of the escaped teenagers at the grocery store. She looked so much like Jennifer, his former student, that he'd followed her. When she saw him and whispered, "Help us," he'd hidden them while trying to figure out what to do. "I thought I was going insane," Vernon told Delbert later, "seeing my dead students. But then they told me the truth, and I knew I had to protect them, even if it meant everyone thinking I'd lost my mind." The case shocked Millfield. Norman Wallace was charged with 6 counts of murder from 1989, 6 counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and identity theft. He was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial and confined to a maximum security psychiatric facility. The 6 teenagers were reunited with their families. All would require extensive therapy, but they survived. Vernon Crawford was cleared of any wrongdoing. He had been trying to protect the children while gathering evidence. The town recognized him as a hero, though he refused the label. "I just did what any teacher would do," he said. "I protected the kids." But the trauma remained. Vernon couldn't stop thinking about his 6 students who had actually died, whose identities had been stolen by a madman trying to rewrite history. On the real anniversary of the crash, Vernon held a small memorial concert at his house. The 6 rescued teenagers attended, playing the instruments they'd been forced to learn. But this time, they played what they wanted, modern songs, full of life. "This is for Jennifer, Michael, Susan, David, Robert, and Amy," Vernon said. "The real ones. May they rest in peace." As the music filled his house, Norma Reed listened from next door and wept. Not from fear this time, but from relief that sometimes, even in the darkest stories, some children could be saved. The SWAT team surrounded 892 Sycamore Street at 1:35 a.m. Officer Delbert watched from the command post as thermal imaging showed 1 adult figure on the main floor and 2 smaller heat signatures in what appeared to be the basement. "Confirmation on the basement?" the SWAT commander asked. "2 juveniles, likely restrained based on lack of movement," the tech reported. "Adult subject is mobile, appears agitated." Delbert thought about the 4 teenagers back at Vernon's house, traumatized but alive. According to them, Wallace had an elaborate routine. Every night at midnight he made them rehearse, recreating conversations the dead students had, practicing their instruments, even writing in journals as if they were living in 1989. "He made us watch videos," Jennifer had told them, "old home movies of the real students. We had to memorize everything. How they walked, talked, laughed. If we got it wrong, he'd lock us in the dark for days. The SWAT team breached at 1:47 a.m. Delbert heard it over the radio. Police, search warrant. Basement clear, 2 victims secured, need medical. Suspect fleeing rear exit, in pursuit. Norman Wallace was tackled in his backyard, clutching a duffel bag full of VHS tapes and photographs. When they turned him over, Delbert barely recognized him. The man, who was supposed to have died in 1989, had undergone extensive plastic surgery. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same from the old faculty photos. "You don't understand," Wallace said as they cuffed him. "I was fixing it. I was making it right." The basement was a nightmare museum. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with photographs of the 6 students who died in 1989. Every detail of their lives documented. Report cards, love letters, diary entries Wallace had somehow obtained. 6 beds were arranged exactly like they would have been in the van that crashed. The 2 teenagers, Kenny Hartley, 16 from Indiana, and Lisa Morrison, 15 from Michigan, were found locked in a cage-like structure Wallace had built. They were wearing Millfield High School band uniforms from 1989, complete with name tags reading Robert and Amy. "He was going to drive us tomorrow night," Lisa told the paramedics. "Same route the van took in '89. He said if we played our parts perfectly, if we were good enough students, we'd make it home safe and everything would be fixed." At the station, Norman Wallace's interrogation revealed the depth of his delusion. He genuinely believed he could undo the crash by recreating it with different victims. "I didn't fall asleep that night," he insisted to Detective Barnes. "Someone drugged my coffee. Someone wanted those kids dead. I survived because I was meant to fix it." "Mr. Wallace, you caused the crash. The investigation proved you fell asleep at the wheel." "No, that's what they wanted everyone to think. But I know the truth, and I know how to fix it. Those kids I found, they're perfect. They could be them. They could live the lives that were stolen." Forensic analysis of Wallace's house revealed he had been planning this for years. He had fake documentation showing he died in the crash, had assumed a new identity, and had spent decades obsessing over the 6 dead students. In a hidden room, investigators found journals dating back to 1990. The entries showed Wallace's gradual descent into delusion. October 15th, 1990. 1 year. They visit me in dreams. They want to come back. October 15th, 1995. I've found a way. If I can find the right ones who look like them, sound like them. October 15th, 2000. The first attempt failed. The girl ran. She didn't understand I was saving her. There were references to other victims over the years. Teenagers who had escaped or been released when they didn't match Wallace's exact requirements. The FBI got involved, trying to track down these previous victims. Vernon Crawford was interviewed extensively. He had genuinely been trying to protect the teenagers while figuring out who they really were. When Vernon Crawford sat in the police station, exhausted but relieved. The 4 teenagers he'd been hiding were safe, receiving medical attention and waiting for their families. When Jennifer, the girl who looks like my student, approached me at the grocery store, I thought I was hallucinating, Vernon told Officer Delbert. But she grabbed my arm and whispered, "He makes us pretend to be dead kids. Please help." That's when I knew something terrible was happening. The FBI arrived by morning, taking over the investigation. Norman Wallace's house yielded more evidence. He had been stalking runaways at bus stations, selecting ones who resembled the dead students. Over 20 years, at least 15 teenagers had been taken. Some escaped, some were released when they didn't match his requirements, and some were still missing. Wallace's psychiatric evaluation revealed severe PTSD combined with delusional disorder. He genuinely believed the crash had been orchestrated by some conspiracy, and that by recreating it with better students who would survive, he could prove his innocence. The real students were flawed, Wallace told the psychiatrist. Jennifer talked back. Michael was failing math. These new ones were perfect. They would have made it. Officer Wilma, who had arrived as backup, interviewed the rescued teenagers. Their stories were heartbreaking. "He made us eat what they ate," Lisa Morrison said. "Wear their clothes. He'd quiz us constantly. If we got their middle names wrong or forgot their birthdays, he'd punish us." Kenny Hartley added, "The worst part was the rehearsals. Every night at midnight, we had to get in positions like we were in the van. He'd play a tape of the road sounds, make us sing the songs they were supposedly singing when they crashed." The investigation revealed Wallace had been living under the identity of Norman Wells, working as a private music teacher. Parents had trusted him with their children, never knowing his true identity. Fortunately, he had never harmed any of his regular students. His delusion was specifically focused on the 6 who died in 1989. Vernon Crawford became a key witness. His decision to hide the teenagers instead of immediately calling police was controversial, but the teenagers testified he had saved their lives. "We were terrified," Jennifer, real name Sarah Goldman, testified. "Wallace had told us if we ever escaped, he had people watching who would kill us and our families. Mr. Crawford made us feel safe for the first time in months." The real tragedy emerged when investigators found Wallace's archive room. 6 mannequins dressed in the dead students' actual clothes, which he'd somehow acquired. Their real instruments. Even their school books, with homework still tucked inside from 1989. But most disturbing was a van in his garage. The exact same model as the one that crashed, restored, and modified with special locks that could only be opened from the driver's seat. He had been planning to drive the kidnapped teenagers on the exact route on October the 15th, believing that if he stayed awake this time, if he delivered them safely, history would be rewritten. The town of Millfield struggled to process the revelation. Many remembered the crash, had mourned the students. To learn that their substitute teacher had survived and spent decades trying to undo his crime through kidnapping was incomprehensible. A memorial service was held for the real victims of 1989. Their families, many of whom had moved away, returned for closure. The 6 rescued teenagers attended, no longer forced to wear the dead students' identities. "My daughter has been gone for 34 years, said Mrs. Patterson, mother of the real Jennifer. To know someone was using her memory, her identity for this sick fantasy, it's unbearable. But I'm grateful these children were saved. Norman Wallace was found guilty but mentally ill. He was sentenced to life in a secure psychiatric facility. During his sentencing, he still insisted he was trying to save everyone. You don't understand, he said to the judge. They're still trapped in that van. Every October 15th, they die again. I was their only hope. Vernon Crawford retired from teaching shortly after the trial. The trauma of hiding the teenagers, of reliving the loss of his students, was too much. But he stayed in touch with the 6 rescued teens, who considered him their hero. On the first anniversary after the rescue, the 6 teenagers returned to Millfield. They held a concert, not as the dead students they'd been forced to portray, but as themselves. They played modern songs, wore their own clothes, used their real names. This is for Mr. Crawford. Sarah, who'd been forced to be Jennifer, announced, who saw us for who we really were, not who we were forced to be. Officer Delbert, who attended the concert, noticed Vernon crying in the back row. not from sadness, but from relief that these 6 at least had survived. The case led to new protocols for missing teenagers and identity theft involving minors. The Wallace method became a studied phenomenon in criminal psychology. The dangerous delusion that crimes could be undone by reenacting them with different victims. 5 years later, Delbert received a letter from Sarah Goldman. She had graduated college, become a social worker specializing in helping kidnapping survivors. "Mr. Crawford saved us by believing us," she wrote. "Sometimes that's all it takes, one person who sees through the lies to the truth." Vernon Crawford died peacefully in 2028. At his funeral, 6 middle-aged people no one recognized arrived. They were the survivors, come to pay respects to the teacher who chose to protect them when it mattered most. Norma Reed, the neighbor whose 911 call had started everything, lived to be 93. She always maintained that she knew something was terribly wrong that night. "Vernon was a good man in an impossible situation," she said in her final interview about the case. "He heard those children's cries for help and answered. That's what neighbors do." The house at 892 Sycamore, where Wallace had lived, was demolished. But every October 15th, people still leave flowers at the memorial for the 6 students who died in 1989. The real ones, whose memories were finally allowed to rest in peace. 6 months after Norman Wallace's arrest, Officer Delbert was called to testify at a federal hearing about missing children and identity theft. The Wallace case had exposed gaps in the system. How someone declared dead could continue living under a false identity for over 30 years. Wallace selected his victims carefully, Delbert testified. Runaways with no immediate family searching for them. Kids who wouldn't be missed quickly. He gave them food, shelter, and twisted affection in exchange for becoming someone else entirely. The FBI had tracked down 12 more victims from over the years. Some had escaped and never reported it, too traumatized and afraid no one would believe them. Others had been released when Wallace decided they weren't perfect enough for his delusion. One survivor, now 38, testified via video link. "I was 15 when he took me in 1997. For 6 months, I had to be Michael. He made me learn to play trumpet, memorize this dead kid's life. When I finally escaped, I didn't even remember who I really was anymore." Vernon Crawford also testified, his voice steady but emotional. Those 6 students who died in 1989 were talented, bright kids with their whole lives ahead of them. What Wallace did, using their memories, their identities for his sick fantasy, it dishonored everything they were. The hearing led to new legislation. The Wallace Act, requiring periodic verification of death records against identity documents, and mandatory reporting when children claim to be someone other than who they appeared to be. Back in Millfield, the community struggled with the revelation. Many remembered Norman Wallace as a dedicated substitute teacher before the crash. How had no one noticed his survival and transformation? Detective Barnes discovered the answer in Wallace's journals. The crash hadn't been an accident at all, but murder disguised as tragedy. A year after the rescue, Delbert checked in on the 6 survivors. They had formed a support group, meeting virtually every month. Sarah Goldman, formerly Jennifer, had become their unofficial leader. "We call ourselves the Underground 6, she told Delbert. "Not because we were hidden underground, but because we were buried under false identities. Now, we're helping other identity theft victims, especially minors." Vernon Crawford had joined them as an advisor. Despite his initial trauma from hiding them, he'd become a grandfather figure to the group. He helped them reclaim their real identities while honoring the memory of his actual students. The real Jennifer, Michael, Susan, David, Robert, and Amy deserved to be remembered for who they were. Vernon said at a memorial service, not as pawns in a madman's delusion, but as the vibrant young people they were. The service was held at Millfield High School's new music room, funded by donations after the case made national news. 6 plaques bore the names and photos of the students who died in 1989. Below each name was a brief biography, their dreams, achievements, and the lives they'd planned to live. Norman Wallace died in the psychiatric facility 3 years after his conviction. He never abandoned his delusion, insisting to the end that he'd been trying to save everyone. His death brought little closure to anyone involved. Officer Wilma, who had assisted in the rescue, specialized in missing children cases after the Wallace investigation. She developed new interview techniques for victims of long-term identity theft. These kids were programmed to lie about who they were, she explained at a training seminar. We had to learn to see past the rehearsed responses to find the real child underneath. 5 years later, a memorial garden was planted where Wallace's house had stood. 6 trees for the students who died in 1989. 6 benches for the survivors who were rescued. A plaque read, "In memory of those lost and in honor of those saved." May their true names never be forgotten. Norma Reed, whose 911 call had saved 6 lives, was honored by the city, but she remained humble about her role. "I just knew something was wrong," she said. "Vernon's a good man, but those sounds coming from his house that night, no good man makes sounds like that alone." I had to call. The 911 recording of her call became part of police training, an example of how concerned citizens could help identify crimes in progress. "My name is Norma Reed. I live at 447 Oak Street. Something terrible is happening next door." That call, Delbert knew, had been the first domino. Without it, 6 teenagers might have been driven to their deaths in a delusional reenactment of a 30-year-old tragedy. 10 years after the rescue, Delbert retired from the force. At his retirement party, 6 guests surprised him, the survivors, now in their late 20s and early 30s. They had careers, families, real lives built on their real identities. "You gave us our names back," Sarah told him. "Our real names, our real lives, thank you." Vernon Crawford had passed away 2 years earlier, but his memorial fund continued supporting young musicians, living ones pursuing their own dreams with their own names. The last time Delbert drove past Oak Street before moving to Florida in retirement, he stopped at Vernon's old house. A young family lived there now, unaware of the history. Children played in the yard where Vernon had once hidden 6 traumatized teenagers. Delbert thought about that night, Norma's frantic 911 call, Vernon's desperate attempt to protect the kids, Wallace's sick delusion finally ending. It had been one of the strangest cases of his career, but also one of the most important. 6 kids got to grow up as themselves because of that call. As he drove away, Delbert noticed Norma Reed, now 91, in her garden. She waved, and he waved back. Some neighbors, he thought, save lives just by paying attention. The Millfield case became a studied example in criminal psychology textbooks. The Wallace delusion, the belief that crimes could be undone by reenacting them with different victims, was now a recognized phenomenon. But more importantly, it became a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing 911 calls led to the most important rescues. In the end, 6 teenagers lived because one elderly neighbor heard something wrong and made a call. Because one retired teacher chose protection over protocol. Because one officer looked past the obvious to find the hidden truth. Their real names were Sarah Goldman, Marcus Jefferson, Ashley Tanner, Brian Park, Kenny Hartley, and Lisa Morrison. They were not Jennifer, Michael, Susan, David, Robert, and Amy. They were themselves. And that, Delbert knew as he settled into retirement, was the only identity that truly mattered.